Chapter 1. The Primordial Balance. In the howling depths of the immaterium, where thought becomes reality and emotion takes murderous form, 4 titanic entities have waged an eternal war since the dawn of consciousness itself. The Chaos Gods, Khorne the Blood God, Tzeentch the Architect of Fate, Nurgle the Plague Father, and Slaanesh the Dark Prince exist in a delicate, savage equilibrium that has defined the very nature of chaos for countless millennia. This is the great game, a conflict so fundamental to existence that it predates the rise and fall of countless civilizations. It is not merely war as mortals understand it, but a cosmic dance of opposing forces, each god representing a primal aspect of sentient emotion and desire. The game's rules are written in the very fabric of the warp itself. When one god grows too powerful, the others unite against it. When alliances form, they inevitably crumble through betrayal. When victory seems within grasp, the eternal balance reasserts itself. Khorne, eldest among the 4, was born from the first murder committed in anger, when primitive minds first knew the intoxicating rush of violence. His domain is the Brass Citadel, a colossal fortress of blood-slicked metal that sits atop a mountain of skulls 10 million years in the making. From his skull throne, the Blood God commands legions of bloodletters and roars his eternal fury at a universe that dares to exist without endless war. He despises magic, considering it the tool of weaklings, and holds particular hatred for Slaanesh, whose hedonistic corruption of martial honor fills him with murderous rage. Tzeentch, the changer of ways, was emerged when the first sentient being conceived of tomorrow being different from today. His crystal labyrinth shifts and changes with each breath, its impossible geometries reflecting infinite possibilities and pathways through fate. The Architect of Fate delights in complexity, weaving plots within plots until even he sometimes forgets their ultimate purpose. His greatest rival is Nurgle, whose stagnant acceptance stands as the antithesis of Tzeentch's constant change. Nurgle, the Lord of Decay, was given birth by the first creature to fear death, and in that fear find perverse comfort in inevitable entropy. His garden blooms with beautiful corruption, where plagues take artistic form, and death is merely another stage of an endless cycle. The Plague Father loves all his children equally, demon and mortal alike, and seeks to spread his gifts throughout the universe. His opposition to Tzeentch runs deeper than mere rivalry. It is philosophical warfare between change and stagnation, hope and despair. Slaanesh, youngest of the 4, exploded into existence during the final days of the Eldari Empire, born from a race's pursuit of perfection that became an orgy of excess beyond imagination. The Dark Prince's Palace of Pleasure stands as a monument to every sensation mortals have ever craved, every experience pushed beyond the boundaries of sanity. Slaanesh seeks the perfect moment, the ultimate experience, the sensation that transcends all others. This brings eternal conflict with Khorne, whose crude violence lacks the sophistication the Prince of Excess demands. For 10,000 years since the Horus heresy, this balance has held. The gods wage war not merely with demon legions, but with reality itself as their battlefield. When Khorne grows mighty on the blood spilled in galactic conflicts, Tzeentch whispers to generals and changes the tide of battles. When Nurgle's plagues spread too far, Slaanesh tempts mortals with cures that lead to excess, while Khorne inspires them to fight the rot with violence. The cycle continues, eternal and seemingly unbreakable. Their conflicts manifest across the galaxy in ways both subtle and catastrophic. World-eaters turn their chainswords on emperors' children when their gods' rivalry filters down to their mortal champions. Thousand Suns battle Death Guard on demon worlds, where Tzeentch and Nurgle's philosophical opposition becomes literal war. Yet always, the balance holds. No god can gain permanent supremacy, for to do so would destroy the very emotions that feed them. But in the closing years of the 41st millennium, as Abaddon the Despoiler marshals his forces for the 13th Black Crusade, something unprecedented stirs in the warp. Ancient currents shift. The delicate web of power that has constrained the gods for millennia begins to fray at its edges. On Cadia, the fortress world that has stood sentinel over the Eye of Terror for 10,000 years, pylons erected by a long-dead race begin to fail. These mysterious structures have long regulated the flow of warp energy, maintaining barriers between real space and the immaterium. As the Despoiler's forces overwhelm the defenders, as the planet itself is torn asunder by the will of the dark gods, something goes catastrophically wrong. The destruction of Cadia does not simply tear a new wound in reality, it creates a psychic shockwave of unprecedented magnitude. The death of a world that has stood defiant against chaos for millennia releases an explosion of conflicting emotions. The rage of the defenders, the ecstasy of the attackers, the despair of the dying, and the hope of those who believe in victory. These emotions crash through the warp like a tsunami, washing over the domains of all four gods simultaneously. For the first time in their existence, all four chaos gods experience a simultaneous surge of power, not the gradual ebb and flow that characterizes the great game, but an instant, overwhelming amplification of their divine essence. Khorne feels the fury of every warrior who died on Cadia's bloody ground. Tzeentch savors every plot that came to fruition, was every scheme that led to this moment. Nurgle tastes the decay of hope itself as the fortress world dies. Slaanesh gorges on the exquisite agony of loss and the intoxicating rush of triumph. In that moment, the ancient equilibrium shatters. The gods, intoxicated by power beyond anything they have experienced, abandon the restraints that have governed their eternal conflict. Each sees in this moment the opportunity not merely to dominate the great game, but to end it forever by destroying their rivals utterly. The careful balance that has prevented any one force from achieving absolute victory crumbles as raw divine will clashes against raw divine will. In the depths of the warp, reality begins to scream. The great game, which has played out in cycles for millions of years, transforms into something else entirely. Total war between gods whose very existence depends on conflict, yet whose nature makes cooperation impossible. The primordial balance that has shaped the destiny of countless civilizations is about to give way to chaos absolute, and neither the warp nor real space may survive what follows. The ancient dance of the four powers has become a death spiral, and the universe itself hangs in the balance as gods who cannot afford to lose prepare to fight a war that cannot be won. Chapter 2. The Trigger Event. The 13th Black Crusade had begun like so many others before it. Abaddon the Despoiler marshalling his chaotic forces for another assault on the hated fortress world of Cadia. For 10,000 years, the planet had stood as an unbreakable barrier between the Eye of Terror and the wider galaxy, was its defenders repelling wave after wave of chaos incursions. The pattern seemed eternal. The forces of darkness would surge forward, the Imperial Guard would hold, and eventually the attackers would retreat to lick their wounds and plan anew. But this time was different. This time, the Warmaster of Chaos had learned from his failures. As the final pylons of Cadia cracked and fell, as the planet's death throes sent shockwaves through both real space and the warp, the psychic resonance of that moment echoed across dimensions with unprecedented force. The death of a world that had defied chaos for millennia created a unique harmonic frequency in the immaterium, one that struck all four chaos gods simultaneously like a thunderbolt of pure emotion. In the brass citadel, Khorne rose from his skull throne for the first time in 1,000 years. For the blood god felt every moment of Cadia's fall as if it were his own victory. Every blade that found flesh, every act of defiance crushed beneath his will, every drop of blood spilled in desperate battle. The psychic echo of 10 million deaths in a single moment filled him with power beyond anything he had experienced since the days of the Horus Heresy. This was not mere warfare. This was conquest absolute, the breaking of an enemy that had stood unconquered for 10 millennia. "Mine!" Khorne bellowed across the warp, his voice shaking the foundations of reality itself. "This victory belongs to war eternal. The throne world falls to the strength of arms, as all things must." But in the crystal labyrinth, Tzeentch laughed with 10,000 voices as probability cascaded in impossible directions. The architect of fate saw deeper than mere military victory. He perceived the intricate web of schemes and manipulations that had led to this moment. Every plot Abaddon had laid, every alliance forged and broken, every twist of fate that brought the crusade to this point, all bore the subtle touch of the changer of ways. This was not Khorne's triumph through mindless violence, but the culmination of the greatest plan ever conceived. "Delusion," Tzeentch whispered across 9 dimensions simultaneously. "The blood god sees only the sword stroke, but I wove the hand that guided it. This moment was written in the stars before Cadia's first stone was laid." Deep in the garden of Nurgle, the Plague Father felt the world's death as a lover feels a caress. Here was entropy triumphant, the ultimate proof that all things must decay. Or the mighty fortress world, symbol of imperial resistance, had finally succumbed to the inevitable rot that claims all things. Cadia's pylons, ancient and proud, crumbled just as flesh crumbles before his gifts. This was not conquest or manipulation. This was the natural order asserting itself at last. "My children," Nurgle cooed to his demon spawn. "See how beautifully all things return to the cycle? Even the mightiest worlds must know the sweet embrace of ending. This moment belongs to entropy, for I am the final truth of all existence." In the Palace of Pleasure, Slaanesh writhed in ecstasy as the psychic shockwave brought the most exquisite sensation the Dark Prince had ever experienced. The agony of the defenders, the ecstasy of the victors, the desperate hope and crushing despair all blended into a symphony of emotion, so perfect it brought tears of joy to the god's androgynous features. This was not mere death or victory or decay. This was art itself, the ultimate expression of sentient experience pushed beyond all conceivable limits. "Divine," Slaanesh moaned, each word dripping with rapture. "Such perfect suffering, such transcendent joy. This moment is mine, for only I truly understand the beauty in both triumph and defeat." For the first time in their existence, all 4 gods felt equally empowered by the same event. The death of Cadia spoke to each of their fundamental natures so perfectly that none could claim supremacy over the others. In that terrible moment of shared omnipotence, the ancient agreements that had governed the great game, the unspoken understanding that prevented total war, shattered like glass. The psychic shockwave that had empowered them also carried something else, the absolute certainty that this moment of perfect balance would never come again. If any god were to achieve ultimate dominion over their rivals, it would have to be now, while the energy of Cadia's destruction still coursed through the warp like liquid fire. Khorne was the first to act. With a roar that shattered demon worlds, he commanded his bloodletters to turn their blades not toward the mortal realm, but toward the domains of his eternal rivals. "No more games," the blood god thundered. "No more balance. The time has come to settle this once and for all." But Tzeentch had anticipated this moment across 1,000,000 possible futures. Even as Khorne's legions marshaled for war, the crystal labyrinth began reshaping itself into a fortress of impossible geometries. Pink horrors materialized not in real space, but within the very courts of rival gods, their gibbering laughter carrying viral memes designed to corrupt enemy demons from within. "You always were the most predictable of us, blood god," Tzeentch taunted across the dimensional divide. "But this time, your rage serves my design." Nurgle felt their hostile intentions like a wound in his generous heart. His brothers had always been ungrateful for his gifts, but this naked aggression could not be tolerated. If they wished to reject the natural order, as then they would learn why entropy was called inevitable. Great unclean ones began their ponderous march, not toward imperial worlds, but toward the gleaming spires of Tzeentch's domain and the brass towers of Khorne's citadel. Such ingratitude, the Plague Father sighed, his voice carrying across the warp like a funeral dirge. I offer them eternal peace, and they choose eternal war. Very well, they shall have both. Slaanesh laughed with pure delight as the others revealed their intentions. How perfectly they had all missed the point. They thought this was about victory, about dominance, about proving philosophical superiority. But the Dark Prince saw the true beauty of the moment. This was about the game itself, elevated to its highest possible form. War between gods was the ultimate sensation, of the final experience that even immortal beings could share. Yes, Slaanesh purred, even as daemonettes began sharpening claws and preparing for battles that would span dimensions. Show me your fury, your schemes, your despair. Show me what gods feel when they face their own ending. This will be exquisite. The traditional patterns of the great game crumbled in that instant. Where once demon legions had been dispatched to corrupt specific worlds or influence mortal conflicts, now they turned inward toward each other's domains. For the first time in cosmic history, the primary targets of chaos were not the material universe, but chaos itself. In the depths of the immaterium, reality began to tear as divine will clashed against divine will without restraint or limitation. So the careful balance that had prevented any one force from achieving ultimate victory was about to be replaced by something far more dangerous: absolute war between entities whose very existence depended on conflict, yet whose nature made cooperation impossible. The psychic echo of Cadia's destruction had done more than empower the gods. It had shown them that the universe could change in ways they had never imagined. And if the universe could change, then so could the fundamental rules that governed their eternal dance. The great game was about to become something else entirely, and neither the warp nor real space might survive the transformation. As the first daemon armies began their march toward rival domains, a new age dawned in the immaterium, an age where the greatest threat to chaos would be chaos itself. The primordial balance was broken, and what would emerge from the wreckage remained to be seen. The gods had tasted absolute power, and now they would discover whether absolute power was worth absolute war. Chapter 3. Blood and Excess Collide. The hatred between Khorne and Slaanesh was older than recorded history, a fundamental opposition that had shaped the nature of violence itself since the first sentient being drew blood in anger. Where Khorne demanded pure, honest battle, warrior against warrior in tests of strength and skill, Slaanesh corrupted that sacred fury into something decadent and perverse. The Dark Prince turned honorable combat into elaborate ritual, transforming the clean necessity of death into an artistic exercise in prolonged suffering. For 10,000 years, what this philosophical divide had simmered beneath the surface of the great game, expressing itself through proxy wars between their mortal champions. World-eaters would clash with Emperor's children across 100 demon worlds, each conflict reflecting their patron's eternal disagreement about the nature of violence. But the empowerment from Cadia's destruction had changed everything. Restraint was no longer possible, and the gods' rivalry was about to explode into open warfare on a scale that would reshape the warp itself. The first blow came without warning. Khorne's rage at Slaanesh's claim to Cadia's victory had been building like pressure in a forge, and when it finally erupted, the violence was spectacular. 1 billion bloodletters materialized simultaneously across the boundaries between the brass citadel and the Palace of Pleasure, not their hellblades already burning with the fury of their master. These were not the measured incursions of the traditional great game. This was invasion absolute, intended to scour every trace of Slaanesh's influence from existence. The demon legions poured through dimensional rifts like a crimson tide, their battle cry shaking the foundations of reality. Blood for the blood god, skulls for the skull throne. They descended upon Slaanesh's pleasure gardens with methodical fury, their axes and swords cutting down sculptures of living flesh and fountains of liquid sensation. Where beauty had bloomed, now only honest slaughter remained. At their head strode the bloodthirsters, greater demons whose presence alone could drive mortals mad with terror. These towering beings of pure violence had been forged in the earliest days of Khorne's dominion, each one a masterwork of destruction, crafted from the essence of perfect war. Their brass and bone armor bore the scars of 1,000,000 battles, and their weapons had drunk the blood of gods and mortals alike. Now they turned their fury upon an enemy they had dreamed of destroying since the moment of their creation. But Slaanesh had not earned dominion over excess through weakness. The Dark Prince's response was immediate and devastating. As the bloodletters carved their way through the outer gardens, the very ground beneath their feet began to change. Sculptures of perfect beauty animated and began to dance, their movements so hypnotically graceful that even demons of Khorne found their assault faltering. The air itself became thick with pheromones that promised sensations beyond anything the simple joy of battle could provide. "My dear blood god," Slaanesh's voice echoed through dimensions, each word dripping with honeyed poison. "Your warriors fight so crudely. Let me show them what true artistry looks like." Demonettes materialized from thin air, their crab-like claws rending flesh with surgical precision, while their serpentine tongues whispered promises of perfect violence to the attacking bloodletters. These were not mere temptations. They were offers of improvement, ways to make killing more beautiful, more satisfying, more complete than anything Khorne's crude philosophy could provide. Some bloodletters faltered, the promise of perfect technique, of violence so refined it became art itself, proved too alluring to resist. Their howls of rage transformed into moans of anticipation as Slaanesh's corruption took hold, and they turned their weapons on their own battle brothers with new appreciation for the aesthetic of slaughter. Khorne's roar of fury at this treachery could be heard across 17 dimensions. The blood god materialized partially in his own domain, his massive form towering over the brass citadel like a mountain of rage and brass. "Corruption!" he bellowed, each word sending shockwaves through the warp. "You dare defile my warriors with your weakness!" The god's intervention shattered the corruption instantly, his pure fury burning away Slaanesh's influence like fire consuming silk. But the damage was done. For the first time in their eternal conflict, one of the gods had directly intervened in battle rather than working through demon intermediaries. The ancient rules of engagement had been broken, and both gods knew there was no returning to the old ways. Slaanesh laughed with genuine delight at this escalation. The Dark Prince's own manifestation began to coalesce within the Palace of Pleasure, an androgynous figure of terrible beauty, whose very presence made reality weep with aesthetic overload. "Such passion, dear Khorne, such magnificent rage. This is why I adore you so. You make the most exquisite opponent." What followed was combat on a scale that defied mortal comprehension. Bloodthirsters clashed with keepers of secrets in aerial duels that tore holes in the fabric of space itself. Where a bloodthirster's axe met a keeper's claw, reality fractured, to creating wounds in existence that bled pure emotion into the void. The greater demons fought with the fury and skill of beings who had perfected warfare across eons, each blow potentially capable of unmaking lesser gods. The battlefield itself became a character in the conflict. Khorne's influence turned Slaanesh's gardens into brass monuments to slaughter, while the Dark Prince's power transformed the blood god's killing fields into elaborate stages where violence became performance art. Neither god could maintain complete dominance over the environment, creating a constantly shifting landscape where the very ground might change from blood-stained metal to silk cushions, and back again in the span of a heartbeat. And demon worlds that had served as neutral ground between the rival domains found themselves shattered by the intensity of the conflict. These ancient territories, which had existed in the space between godly influences for millions of years, simply could not withstand the direct clash of such opposed forces. Planets made of crystallized screams crumbled into dust. Continents of living flesh were burned away by the purity of Khorne's rage, only to be immediately regrown by Slanesh's regenerative excess. The battle raged across 17 different planes of existence simultaneously. In some dimensions, it appeared as a traditional war between demon armies. In others, it manifested as a philosophical debate conducted through violence, each blow carrying arguments about the nature of perfection and corruption. In the deepest layers of reality, it became pure concept war, the idea of honorable combat locked in mortal struggle with the notion of artistic violence. Neither god could gain decisive advantage. Khorne's forces excelled in direct confrontation, their simple fury overwhelming Slanesh's more complex strategies. But the Dark Prince's ability to corrupt and convert enemy forces meant that victories were often temporary. Bloodletters who fell would rise again as something else, their death agonies transformed into exquisite art that served Slanesh's purposes even as it destroyed them. The intensity of the conflict began to have effects far beyond the immediate battlefield. Warp storms across the galaxy took on new characteristics, some becoming pure zones of violence, while others transformed into regions of maddening beauty. The navigator houses reported that their psychic pilots were experiencing conflicting visions. Some saw paths through the immaterium lined with skulls and brass. Others perceived routes decorated with silk and sensation. Space Marine chapters found their chaos-tainted battle brothers experiencing strange compulsions. World Eaters discovered an unexpected appreciation for the aesthetic beauty of their massacres, while Emperor's children began craving simpler, more direct forms of violence. The philosophical war between the gods was filtering down to their mortal servants, creating confusion and internal conflict within the traitor legions. Most disturbing of all were the reports from imperial worlds near major warp storms. Planetary governors spoke of populations experiencing sudden urges toward either pure violence or elaborate excess, or sometimes switching between the two compulsions within the same day. Regiments of the Astra Militarum found themselves inexplicably drawn to either mindless aggression or complex combat rituals that served no tactical purpose. As the battle entered its third subjective day, time having little meaning in a conflict that spanned multiple dimensions, both gods began to realize the unprecedented nature of what they had unleashed. This was not the controlled opposition of the great game, where conflicts served to maintain cosmic balance. This was existential warfare, each god genuinely attempting to unmake their rival completely. Yet neither could achieve final victory. Khorne's honest fury proved incapable of completely destroying Slanesh's Baroque defenses, while the Dark Prince's corruptions could not permanently subvert the blood god's pure rage. They were too perfectly opposed, too fundamentally necessary to each other's existence. The realization that they might destroy each other, and in doing so, eliminate both honor and excess from the universe, did not bring peace. Instead, it drove both gods to commit even greater forces to the conflict. If victory was impossible through conventional means, then perhaps it could be achieved through sheer overwhelming power. Across the warp, ancient vaults that had been sealed since the war in heaven began to open. Demon princes, who had slumbered for millennia, stirred to wakefulness. Weapons that could wound gods themselves were drawn from storage and prepared for use. The first battle between Khorne and Slanesh was ending, but only because it was about to become something far worse. The conflict's intensity had already begun affecting the other gods' domains, drawing Tzeentch and Nurgle into the escalating war, whether they wished it or not. The great game was transforming into something that had no rules, no limits, and no clear path to victory. As the bloodletters and demonettes withdrew to their respective domains to tend wounds that might never heal, both sides knew that this was only the beginning. War between gods had proven possible. Now they would discover whether such a war could ever truly end. Chapter 4. The Schemer's Gambit. While Khorne and Slaanesh tore at each other's domains with unprecedented fury, Tzeentch watched from his crystal labyrinth with the satisfaction of a master craftsman observing his greatest work unfold. The architect of fate had seen this moment across 10,000 possible futures, had woven the threads of causality to ensure that when Cadia fell, it would create exactly the conditions needed for his ultimate triumph. The other gods, in their simple-minded pursuit of direct conflict, had missed the true opportunity presented by their mutual empowerment. They saw the moment as a chance to destroy their rivals through brute force. But Tzeentch understood that power was never about strength. It was about understanding, manipulation, and the patient cultivation of inevitability. From his throne of ever-changing crystal, the Lord of Change began to weave schemes within schemes, each plot designed to exploit the chaos of the Khorne-Slaanesh war for his own advancement. Where his brothers saw only the immediate battle, Tzeentch perceived the infinite web of possibilities that their conflict had created. Every sword stroke, every corruption, every moment of divine fury opened new pathways through fate that could be subtly influenced and guided. "Magnificent," he whispered to himself, his voice echoing through dimensions that existed only in potential. They fight so beautifully, so predictably. Each believes they understand the nature of victory, but only I see the true prize that awaits. The Changer of Ways began his work with characteristic subtlety. Pink horrors, those gibbering demons of mutation and madness, began materializing not in real space, but within the very armies of Khorne and Slaanesh. Unlike the crude infiltration tactics his rivals employed, Tzeentch's intervention was surgical in its precision. The pink horrors did not seek to corrupt or destroy. Instead, they whispered suggestions, planted doubts, and offered tactical advice that seemed helpful, but inevitably led to prolonged conflict. To Khorne's bloodletters, they whispered of Slaanesh's weaknesses. "Strike there, where the pleasure gardens meet the torture chambers. Your axes will find soft flesh, and the screams will be exquisite." To Slaanesh's demonettes, they murmured secrets of Khorne's defenses. "The brass gates weaken when his rage peaks. Time your assault for the moment of his greatest fury, and his own strength will become vulnerability." Both suggestions were true, but incomplete. The weaknesses existed, but exploiting them would require precisely the kind of elaborate, drawn-out engagements that would consume both gods' resources, while leaving them vulnerable to outside manipulation. Tzeentch was not seeking to ensure victory for either side. He was orchestrating a stalemate that would allow him to claim supremacy, while his rivals exhausted themselves in futile conflict. The strategy might have succeeded, if not for the fact that he was not the only god capable of long-term thinking. In the rotting gardens that surrounded his manse, Nurgle felt his ancient rival's machinations like an itch that could never be scratched. The Plague Father had endured Tzeentch's schemes for eons, had watched countless plots unfold with the patient resignation of one who understood that all things must eventually decay. But this time was different. This time, the Changer of Ways threatened to upset not just the temporary balance of the great game, but the fundamental nature of existence itself. Nurgle's disgust was not the hot anger of Khorne or the cold fury of Slaanesh. It was the deep, abiding revulsion of entropy faced with endless change. Where Tzeentch saw infinite possibility, Nurgle saw chaos that rejected the natural order of death and renewal. The architect of fate's manipulations were a cancer upon the universe's healthy cycle of growth, decay, and rebirth. "Enough," the Lord of Decay sighed, his voice carrying the weight of cosmic disappointment. "My brother's ambitions have grown beyond all reason. If he will not accept the natural order, then he must be taught the inevitability of entropy. The Plague Father's response was characteristically methodical, and deep within his laboratories, if such a sterile term could be applied to the fertile gardens of corruption, his greatest champions began cultivating new diseases. These were not the familiar plagues that had served Nurgle for millennia, but specialized viruses of stagnation designed specifically to target the fundamental nature of change itself. The Rot of Certainty was the first to emerge from Nurgle's workshops, a spiritual disease that infected probability itself. Where it spread, the infinite, branching paths of possibility that Tzeentch manipulated began to wither and collapse. Potential futures died like flowers in winter, leaving only the grim certainty of inevitable decay. The plague of static thought followed soon after, a mind virus that turned Tzeentch's own gift for complexity against itself. But those infected found their schemes becoming increasingly elaborate and self-contradictory until they collapsed under their own weight. Plans within plans became tangled knots of causality that strangled themselves before they could bear fruit. Most insidious of all was the canker of final form, a disease that attacked the very concept of mutation and transformation. Pink horrors exposed to its influence found themselves locked in their current shape, unable to split or change or adapt. Lords of Change discovered their mastery over metamorphosis failing as their bodies insisted on maintaining static, decaying forms. As these new plagues began to seep into the crystal labyrinth through the dimensional cracks created by the Khorne/Slaanesh War, Tzeentch experienced something he had not felt in millions of years. Genuine surprise. But the first sign of trouble came when his plans began failing in unpredictable ways. Schemes that should have unfolded over centuries collapsed in moments as key variables suddenly became fixed and immutable. The infinite possibilities he had been weaving began to crystallize into single, inevitable outcomes, all of them leading to stagnation and decay. Impossible, Tzeentch hissed, as another layer of his grand design crumbled into dust. Change cannot be stopped. Possibility cannot be limited. I am the master of... But even as he spoke, he felt Nurgle's influence spreading through his domain like a slow poison. The crystal labyrinth, which normally shifted and reconfigured itself constantly, began to slow and solidify. Pathways that had been fluid became fixed. No chambers that had existed in multiple states simultaneously were forced to choose single, permanent forms. Great unclean ones, ancient and patient as decay itself, began their ponderous march on the crystal labyrinth. These towering demons moved with the inevitability of erosion, their very presence causing the walls of Tzeentch's fortress to age and crumble. They did not charge like Khorne's bloodletters or seduce like Slaanesh's demonettes. They simply advanced with the certainty of time itself, knowing that all things must eventually fall to entropy. Tzeentch's response was swift and desperate. Lords of Change took wing from their crystalline perches, their mastery over transformation and mutation brought to bear against Nurgle's plague-bearers. But the Architect of Fate discovered to his horror that his greatest weapons had been turned against him. His demon's ability to change and adapt was being slowly strangled by Nurgle's diseases of stagnation. The first temporal anomalies began manifesting as Tzeentch's manipulation of fate started to backfire catastrophically. Time itself began to rebel against his interference, creating loops and paradoxes that threatened to tear the warp apart. Past, present, and future became tangled together in impossible knots as the Changer of Ways' own power turned chaotic and uncontrolled. In some regions of the Crystal Labyrinth, events began happening in reverse. Demons died before being born, plans succeeded before being conceived, and victories transformed into defeats that had never occurred. The very foundations of causality began to buckle under the strain of competing divine influences. Tzeentch found himself fighting a war on multiple fronts, against Nurgle's advancing forces, against his own malfunctioning schemes, and against the temporal anomalies that his desperate manipulations were creating. For the first time in his existence, The master of planning was forced to react rather than anticipate. The conflict's four-way nature became undeniable as the effects began spilling over into the Khorne-Slaanesh battleground. Bloodletters discovered their tactics changing mid-charge as temporal loops created conflicting battle plans. Daemonettes found themselves aging rapidly as Nurgle's influence spread beyond its intended targets. The pink horrors split uncontrollably as they tried to adapt to the cascading paradoxes their master had unleashed. In the material universe, the effects were equally dramatic. Navigator houses reported warp routes that led simultaneously to multiple destinations, creating navigation hazards that defied all understanding. Astropathic communications became garbled as messages were received before being sent or arrived centuries after their intended recipients had died. Chaos Space Marines found themselves experiencing conflicting visions of their destiny. Thousand Sun sorcerers discovered their spells producing random effects as the underlying structure of magic became unstable. Death Guard Plague Marines watched in confusion as their diseases began accelerating and decelerating unpredictably, to sometimes healing their targets instead of harming them. The Imperium, already reeling from the effects of the Great Rift and the intensifying war between Khorne and Slaanesh, struggled to comprehend this new layer of cosmic chaos. Planetary governors sent increasingly desperate reports of populations experiencing rapid aging, unexpected mutations that reversed themselves, and plagues that cured diseases they had never contracted. But perhaps most disturbing were the reports from imperial scholars and tech priests who had begun to study the phenomenon. Their calculations suggested that the conflict between divine forces of change and stagnation was creating a resonance effect that threatened the fundamental laws of physics. Reality itself was becoming unstable as opposing cosmic forces tore at its foundations. And as the chapter reached its climax, all four gods found themselves engaged in unprecedented warfare. Khorne and Slaanesh continued their direct assault on each other's domains, but now they were forced to contend with temporal anomalies that made tactical planning impossible. Tzeentch struggled to maintain control over his own schemes while defending against Nurgle's plague bearers. Nurgle found his carefully cultivated diseases mutating unpredictably as they encountered Tzeentch's chaotic influence. The great game had evolved beyond a simple contest for dominance. It had become a complex, multidimensional conflict where victory for any single participant seemed increasingly impossible. Each god's actions created reactions that empowered their enemies, while their own strengths were turned against them by the cosmic forces they had unleashed. The ancient balance that had governed the relationship between the Chaos Gods for millions of years was not merely broken, it was being replaced by something far more dangerous and unpredictable. The war had taken on a life of its own, growing beyond the control of even the entities who had started it. In the depths of the warp, reality continued to scream as divine will clashed against divine will without restraint or compromise. The universe itself hung in the balance as four cosmic forces discovered that absolute power, when wielded without wisdom, could destroy even those who possessed it. The scheme within the scheme within the scheme was unraveling, and not even the architect of fate could see how it would end. Chapter 5. The Plague of Change. The war between Nurgle and Tzeentch had begun as a philosophical disagreement made manifest through demon legions and divine will. But as the conflict intensified beyond all previous bounds, something unprecedented began to occur. The very foundations of existence started to unravel where their opposing forces met. In Nurgle's garden, the eternal cycle of death and rebirth that had defined the Plague Father's domain for eons began to falter for the first time in cosmic history. Where once diseased flowers had bloomed, withered, and been reborn in endless succession, now they found themselves caught in impossible states of transition. Blossoms of crystallized plague tried to decay according to their nature, but Tzeentch's influence forced them to change instead, not into healthy growth, but into new forms of corruption that had no place in Nurgle's careful taxonomy of rot. The garden's great trees of entropy, ancient beyond mortal comprehension, and grown from the bones of the first creatures to fear death, began to twist and mutate as change magic infected their bark. Their branches, which should have borne fruit of beautiful decay, instead sprouted crystalline growths that defied natural law. These mutations were neither alive nor dead, neither growing nor decaying. They existed in a state of constant flux that violated everything Nurgle's domain represented. Plague-bearers, those patient demon accountants who had spent millions of years cataloguing every disease and pestilence in existence, found their fundamental nature under assault. As they attempted to record new infections in their endless tallies, the numbers themselves began changing faster than they could write. Diseases transformed mid-count, symptoms shifted between observations, and entire categories of pestilence evolved beyond recognition before they could be properly classified. Most disturbing of all, the plague-bearers themselves began to experience unwanted transformation. Their bodies, which had maintained the same blessed state of constant decay for eons, started mutating unpredictably. Limbs regrew only to wither again. Pustules healed and reopened in different configurations, and their beloved rot became a chaotic mixture of disease and change that satisfied neither god's vision. "This is intolerable," moaned Epidemius, Nurgle's tallyman of plagues, as he watched his carefully maintained records dissolve into meaningless scrawl. "How can one count what refuses to remain counted? How can one catalogue what will not stay catalogued?" In the crystal labyrinth, Tzeentch's demons faced the opposite but equally devastating problem. Lords of change, those mighty sorcerer demons who embodied their master's gift for transformation, found their mutations becoming locked in place by Nurgle's influence. Wings that should have shifted between forms of feather, crystal, and flame became permanently fixed in states of partial decay. Eyes that normally saw across multiple dimensions clouded with cataracts that would not clear. The pink horrors, simple creatures of pure mutability, suffered the worst fate of all. As Nurgle's stagnation plagues infected them, they lost their ability to split and change. These demons, whose very existence was defined by constant transformation, began experiencing something their kind had never known: permanence. The horror of being locked in a single form drove many of them to madness, their gibbering laughter taking on notes of genuine despair. Blue horrors, born from the splitting of their pink cousins, found themselves unable to complete their life cycle. They remained trapped in their melancholy blue forms, unable to divide into the brimstone horrors that represented the final stage of their existence. The natural progression that had defined their species for millions of years simply stopped, creating populations of confused, static demons that violated the fundamental nature of change. Where the opposing forces met directly, reality itself began to break down in ways that defied all understanding. Temporal loops formed spontaneously as change and stagnation cancelled each other out, creating pockets of existence where past, present, and future collapsed into meaningless singularities. In these zones, demons might die before being born, only to be resurrected into a state they had never achieved, then locked into that paradoxical existence forever. The most dangerous manifestation of this cosmic contradiction was the emergence of null zones, regions where the fundamental forces that powered chaos simply ceased to exist. These weren't areas of peace or order, but voids of absolute nothingness where neither magic nor corruption could survive. They appeared first at the boundaries between the gods' domains, small tears in reality that expanded slowly but inexorably. Within these null zones, demons didn't die. They simply stopped being. Their essence wasn't destroyed or dispersed, but reduced to a state of non-existence that was somehow worse than death. Demon princes, who had survived the war in heaven and witnessed the birth of stars, found themselves facing oblivion not through violence or corruption, but through the simple negation of their fundamental nature. Tzeentch was the first to comprehend the true scope of the disaster. From his ever-shifting throne, the architect of fate watched in growing horror as probability lines that had existed since the birth of consciousness began to wither and die. His ability to see potential futures, the gift that defined his very existence, was being systematically erased as more and more possibilities collapsed into null states. Impossible, he whispered through 1,000 voices, but even as he spoke, he felt the word becoming literally true. The very concept of possibility was being murdered by his conflict with Nurgle, replaced by an absolute certainty of non-existence that threatened to consume everything. Nurgle felt the same creeping dread, though he experienced it differently. The Lord of Decay watched in mounting alarm as his carefully tended plagues began eating themselves out of existence. Diseases that had taken eons to perfect were being transformed so rapidly by Tzeentch's influence that they lost all coherent structure. The beautiful cycle of infection, growth, decay, and renewal that formed the foundation of his philosophy was being replaced by chaotic mutation that led nowhere. For the first time in their eternal existence, both gods experienced genuine fear. Not the fear of defeat, they had faced that many times in the great game, but the fear of extinction. Their conflict was creating conditions where chaos itself might cease to exist, taking them and everything they had ever created into oblivion. The realization struck them simultaneously. If they continued this path, there would be no victor, because there would be nothing left to rule over. Tzeentch was the first to attempt reconciliation, his nature compelling him to see the long-term consequences of their actions. Through dimensions that barely still existed, he reached out to his ancient rival with an offer of truce. "Brother," his voice echoed across the withering boundaries between their domains, "we must cease this madness. Our opposition creates destruction beyond even our ability to comprehend. Or surely we can find common ground before." But Nurgle's response was immediate and devastating. The Plague Father had learned to distrust Tzeentch's words over millions of years of conflict, and even in the face of mutual annihilation, that suspicion remained paramount. "Lies," Nurgle rumbled, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "You seek only to distract me while you complete some new scheme. I know your nature, changer of ways. Even now, you plot my destruction while speaking of peace." The accusation was not entirely unfair. Even as Tzeentch proposed their ceasefire, part of his consciousness was indeed calculating how this moment of apparent weakness might be exploited. His very nature made it impossible for him to offer truly unconditional cooperation. There was always an angle, though always a hidden advantage to be gained. Nurgle's rejection triggered an immediate escalation. Great unclean ones that had been held in reserve began their advance on the crystal labyrinth's outer defenses, their presence accelerating the decay of Tzeentch's crystalline walls. In response, Lords of Change took wing to assault the garden's inner sanctums, their magic seeking to transform Nurgle's most prized cultivations into something utterly alien to his nature. The renewed fighting created even larger null zones, regions of non-existence that began expanding at an exponential rate. Ancient demon princes who had witnessed the birth of galaxies found themselves fleeing before an enemy that couldn't be fought, the simple absence of everything they were. Planetary-sized regions of the warp became voids where psychic energy went to die. Astropaths across the galaxy began reporting that certain areas of the immaterium had become completely impassable. Not because they were too dangerous to traverse, but because they simply weren't there anymore. The effects began manifesting in real space with increasing intensity. Imperial worlds found themselves experiencing temporal anomalies where aging and regeneration occurred simultaneously, creating populations that existed in impossible states between life and death. Chaos space. Marines discovered their mutations becoming unstable, transforming so rapidly that their power armor couldn't adapt to their changing physiology. Most disturbing were the reports from navigator houses, whose psychers were beginning to detect areas in the warp that registered as absolute void on their psychic instruments. These weren't storms or demon-infested regions. They were places where the immaterium itself had ceased to exist, creating navigation hazards that could trap ships in permanent isolation. Tech priests of the Adeptus Mechanicus, always fascinated by anomalous phenomena, began studying the null zones with increasing alarm. Their calculations suggested that the voids were expanding according to mathematical progressions that could, if left unchecked, eventually consume entire solar systems. The war between cosmic forces wasn't just threatening the chaos gods, it was threatening the fundamental structure of reality itself. As the chapter reached its climax, both Tzeentch and Nurgle found themselves trapped in a paradox of their own making. Their conflict had grown beyond their ability to control, yet neither could afford to stop fighting without risking defeat at the hands of their rival. The null zones continued to expand, consuming demons, demon worlds, and eventually portions of their own divine domains. Several more attempts at temporary truces were made, and immediately abandoned, as each god detected hidden schemes in the other's proposals. Tzeentch couldn't help but see opportunities for advantage in any agreement, while Nurgle's fundamental mistrust of change made him suspicious of any alteration to their current relationship. The cosmic stalemate that resulted was more dangerous than open warfare. Neither god could achieve victory, but neither could afford to cease their efforts. They were locked in a death spiral that threatened to take all of chaos with them into oblivion. In the deepest regions of the null zones, or something even more terrifying began to manifest, not the absence of chaos, but its complete negation. These weren't spaces where order reigned, but voids where the very concepts of order and chaos became meaningless. They represented a return to the primordial state that had existed before consciousness first gave birth to the gods, a universe without meaning, purpose, or even the possibility of either. The war between change and stagnation had revealed the ultimate truth about the nature of chaos, that it was fundamentally unstable, held together only by the careful balance between opposing forces. Tip that balance too far in any direction, and the entire structure would collapse into nothingness. As reality continued to unravel around them, both gods began to understand that their conflict had moved beyond questions of dominance or philosophy. They were now fighting for the right of existence itself to continue, and unless they could find some way to restore the balance they had destroyed, even that most basic victory might slip away. The warp screamed as infinity tried to divide by zero, and the echo of that cosmic agony reached into every corner of the galaxy. Chapter 6. The Great Convergence. The expanding null zones had taught all four chaos gods a terrible lesson. Their conflict had grown beyond any of their individual ability to control, but rather than inspiring restraint, this realization drove them to an even more desperate conclusion. If the war could not be contained, then it must be won decisively before reality itself collapsed. But each god reached the same catastrophic decision simultaneously. Total victory must be achieved through total commitment of forces. What followed was the Great Convergence, a moment when every restraint that had governed the eternal conflict between the ruinous powers was abandoned in favor of absolute warfare on all fronts. For the first time in cosmic history, all four gods committed their entire strength against all three of their rivals simultaneously, transforming the warp into a four-dimensional battlefield where victory for any single participant seemed increasingly impossible. Khorne was the first to abandon all pretense of strategic restraint. The blood god's rage had been building since the moment Tzeentch's pink horrors had begun their interference, and the sight of the null zone spreading through his domain filled him with fury beyond measure. His solution was characteristically direct. If subtle warfare was destroying reality, then perhaps overwhelming force could restore the proper order of conflict. The Brass Citadel, that mighty fortress which had stood unconquered for millions of years, split its vast demon legions between multiple simultaneous assaults. Bloodthirsters led massive formations of bloodletters against Slanesh's Palace of Pleasure, seeking to settle their ancient rivalry through overwhelming violence. Simultaneously, other demon armies marched on Tzeentch's crystal labyrinth, their axes and chain weapons designed to cut through sorcery and reduce complexity to simple carnage. But even Nurgle's garden found itself under assault as Khorne's forces sought to burn away the stagnation that threatened to freeze his warriors in place. "No more games!" Khorne's voice thundered across all dimensions, each word carrying the force of a collapsing star. "No more schemes, no more corruption, only war eternal." But dividing his forces proved more dangerous than the blood god had anticipated. For the first time since his ascension to divinity, Khorne found himself fighting a defensive war as his enemies seized the opportunity presented by his strategic overextension. Slaanesh struck first, launching a counterattack of such elegant brutality that it redefined the very concept of warfare. The Dark Prince's assault on the brass citadel was not the crude frontal assault that Khorne expected, but a multidimensional seduction that sought to corrupt the very foundations of martial honor. Keeper of Secrets materialized within the fortress itself, their presence turning Khorne's own warriors against each other through promises of perfect violence. The Palace of Pleasure simultaneously transformed itself into a fortress unlike anything the Warp had ever seen. Where once there had been gardens of sensation and galleries of excess, now there were killing fields designed to maximize both efficiency and aesthetic beauty. Daemonettes took positions behind barricades crafted from crystallized screams, while the palace's very architecture became a weapon that channeled attacking forces into corridors of exquisite death. "Come then, my beloved warriors," Slaanesh purred across the dimensional barriers. "Let me show you what true perfection looks like. Your crude rage is but raw material for my artistry." Tzeentch, meanwhile, seized upon the chaos to implement the most complex scheme he had ever conceived. The crystal labyrinth began reconfiguring itself, not for defense, but as a massive mechanism designed to redirect and amplify the conflicting energies of his rivals. Where Khorne's forces attacked one entrance, they found themselves emerging from gates that led directly into Nurgle's domain. Where Slaanesh's demons sought to infiltrate through dimensional shifts, they materialized in the middle of bloodletter formations. The Architect of Fate had turned his own domain into a cosmic sorting mechanism, using the attacks against him as components in a grand design meant to force his rivals into destroying each other. The Lords of Change took wing not to engage in direct combat, but to adjust the vast machine of the labyrinth, ensuring that each assault was redirected toward maximum chaos among his enemies. "Behold," Tzeentch laughed, as probability cascaded in impossible directions, "the beauty of perfect planning. You all dance to my design, even as you think you fight against me." Nurgle's response was the most terrifying of all, precisely because it appeared to be the most passive. The Plaguefather made no obvious counterattacks, launched no dramatic assaults, and issued no challenges to his rivals. Instead, he simply opened his garden to all visitors and began to cultivate. What grew in those diseased groves was not merely new plagues or enhanced rot, but fundamental concepts given infectious form. Or the virus of futility spread wherever the other gods' forces clashed, carrying the conviction that all struggle was meaningless. The bacterium of inevitable defeat infected even the greatest demon princes with certainty of eventual failure. Most insidious of all was the spore of final peace, which promised rest to warriors who had fought for eternity. Great unclean ones marched through the dimensional rifts opened by the other gods' conflicts, their presence transforming every battlefield into a garden where violence bloomed briefly before withering into acceptance. They did not fight so much as they simply existed, and their existence was a rebuke to all the fury and ambition surrounding them. "My children," Nurgle's voice carried across the growing carnage like a funeral dirge. "See how beautifully they rage against the inevitable. Let them exhaust themselves in futile struggle. and then offer them the peace they have always secretly desired. The result was warfare on a scale that defied all previous understanding of conflict. The very geography of the warp began reshaping itself as divine wills clashed without restraint. Entire regions of the immaterium were carved up and recombined according to the whims of battling gods, creating landscapes that existed simultaneously in multiple contradictory states. Demon worlds that had remained stable for millions of years found themselves becoming battlefields where the fundamental laws of existence changed moment by moment. On some planets, Khorne's influence turned gravity into a weapon that crushed enemies with increasing fury. On others, Slaanesh's power transformed the very air into an intoxicating drug that made pain indistinguishable from pleasure. Tzeentch's domains experienced constant mutation, with terrain that might be solid rock one moment and flowing crystal the next. Nurgle's influence brought decay that was somehow also renewal, creating cycles of death and rebirth that drove observers mad. The greater demons, those mighty servants who had previously served as generals in carefully planned campaigns, now found themselves leading desperate cross-realm invasions that violated every principle of the great game. Bloodthirsters battled keepers of secrets, while lords of change dueled great unclean ones in aerial combats that tore holes between dimensions. These were not the ritualized conflicts of the past, but existential struggles where the very survival of chaos hung in the balance. Bloodthirster Angrath, mightiest of Khorne's servants, led a massive assault on Slaanesh's inner sanctum, while simultaneously coordinating defensive actions against incursions by Tzeentch's forces and Nurgle's plague-bearers. The ancient daemon, who had once planned campaigns across centuries, now found himself forced to adapt his strategies moment by moment as the battlefield shifted around him. Keeper of Secrets Shalaxi Helbane, perfect in her terrible beauty, waged war on 3 fronts as she sought to corrupt Khorne's warriors while defending against Nurgle's diseases and Tzeentch's mutations. Her flawless form began to show signs of strain as she pushed her abilities beyond even their considerable limits. Lord of Change Kairos Fateweaver, who saw past and future with equal clarity, discovered that his gift had become a curse as the temporal anomalies created by the conflict made prophecy impossible. The two-headed demon found his visions contradicting themselves as multiple futures collapsed into paradoxical singularities. Great Unclean One. Kugath Plaguefather, ancient beyond measure, pursued his experiments in new diseases even as his laboratory was invaded by demon armies from all 3 rival factions. His careful work was constantly interrupted by the need to defend his creations, yet somehow the interruptions themselves became part of his research into the nature of disruption and decay. The psychic echoes of this unprecedented conflict began manifesting in real space with catastrophic intensity. Warp storms that had previously been localized phenomena expanded to engulf entire star systems, each carrying the chaotic energies of the gods' warfare. The Eye of Terror, already vast beyond human comprehension, began expanding at an exponential rate as the barriers between dimensions weakened under the strain of divine combat. Navigator houses across the galaxy reported complete breakdown of their ability to chart safe courses through the warp. The immaterium had become so chaotic that even the most experienced pilots found themselves lost in storms that changed their fundamental nature faster than human consciousness could adapt. Ships that entered the warp discovered themselves in the middle of demon battlefields, their crews forced to witness conflicts between entities whose very existence challenged sanity. As the Astronomicon itself began to flicker, as the Emperor on his golden throne struggled to maintain the psychic beacon that guided humanity through the galaxy. Tech priests monitoring the Great Lighthouse reported that its signal was being interference by competing divine influences, creating navigation hazards that could strand entire fleet battle groups in the void between stars. On thousands of worlds, populations began experiencing mass psychic phenomena as the gods' conflict bled through the barriers of reality. Imperial citizens found themselves compelled toward violence, excess, scheming, or despair, depending on which divine influence happened to be strongest in their local area of the warp. The planetary governors sent increasingly desperate requests for guidance as their worlds tore themselves apart under the influence of conflicting chaos energies. Chaos Space Marines discovered their connection to their patron gods becoming unstable as the deities' attention was consumed by their mutual warfare. World Eaters found their rage becoming unfocused and self-defeating. Emperors' children experienced pleasures so intense they became torment. Thousand Suns saw their sorcery producing random effects as the warp structure became unreliable. Death Guard watched their carefully cultivated diseases mutating beyond recognition. Most terrifying of all were the reports from Inquisitors who had been monitoring chaos activity across the galaxy. Their findings suggested that the conflict between the gods was creating resonance effects that threatened the fundamental structure of reality itself. Ancient seals placed by the Emperor during the Great Crusade were beginning to fail as the psychic pressure from the divine war exceeded their design tolerances. As the Great Convergence reached its peak intensity, all four gods began to realize that they had initiated something beyond their power to control. The null zones continued to expand, consuming increasing portions of their own domains. The temporal anomalies threatened to trap them all in paradox loops that could last for eternity. The very concept of victory was becoming meaningless as the definitions of existence itself began to break down. Yet none could afford to cease their attacks, and each god understood that showing weakness now would invite immediate destruction by their rivals. They were trapped in a spiral of escalation that threatened to consume everything, including themselves. But the logic of their conflict demanded that they continue until either total victory was achieved or total annihilation claimed them all. In the depths of the warp, reality continued to scream as forces that had shaped the universe for millions of years tore at each other with unprecedented fury. The Great Game had become something else entirely, a cosmic death spiral that threatened to take all of existence with it into oblivion. The convergence was complete, and now the universe would discover whether gods could destroy each other or whether their mutual annihilation would take everything else with them. Chapter 7. Mortal Pawns and Broken Legions. The war between gods had begun as a cosmic struggle for dominance in the highest realms of existence. But as the conflict intensified beyond all previous bounds, its effects cascaded down through the layers of reality like poison seeping through stone. For the first time in 10,000 years, the traitor legions found themselves facing a crisis that threatened their very identity. Their patron deities had become too consumed with their mutual warfare to provide the guidance, power, and purpose that had sustained them since the dark days of the Horus heresy. In the Eye of Terror, and across the daemon worlds that served as strongholds for the forces of chaos, Space Marines who had sold their souls for immortality and power discovered that their gods were no longer listening to their prayers. The psychic channels that had carried divine commands for millennia had become chaotic streams of conflicting impulses, overlapping hatreds, and contradictory orders that drove their recipients to madness. Khan, the betrayer, ancient champion of the World Eaters and avatar of Khorne's endless fury, felt the change first as a silence in his blood. The red mist that had guided his actions for 10 millennia suddenly carried the voices of multiple conflicts, not just the pure rage he had served so faithfully, but the corrupted echoes of his god's battles against Slanesh, Tzeentch, and Nurgle. Where once there had been clarity of purpose, now there was only confusion and competing impulses. Standing amidst the blood-soaked training pits of the World Eater's flagship, Khan found himself paralyzed by conflicting commands that seemed to arrive simultaneously from different aspects of his patron deity. One voice demanded that he lead his warriors against the Emperor's children, whom Khorne despised for their corruption of martial honor. Another commanded an assault on the Thousand Suns, whose sorcery had become anathema to the blood god's philosophy. A third voice insisted that the Death Guard were the true enemy, their stagnant acceptance of decay standing as an insult to the purity of violence. "Choose," Khan growled to the empty air, his ancient chain-axe gore-child trembling in his grip. "Tell me which enemy to kill first, and I will paint the void with their blood." But no clear answer came. Only the continuing cacophony of divine fury turned inward upon itself. The crisis was not limited to individual champions. Entire war bands found themselves receiving contradictory orders as their god's attention became fractured by the unprecedented scale of their mutual conflict. A company of world eaters would begin an assault on an imperial world, only to be commanded mid-battle to turn their weapons on nearby emperor's children forces. Squads of noise marines would find their sonic weapons producing discordant notes that reflected their patron's distraction rather than the perfect harmony of violence they had been taught to create. The breakdown became most apparent on the demon world of Sicarus, where representatives from all 4 major traitor legions had gathered for what should have been a coordinated assault on the Ultramar sector. Instead, the meeting devolved into unprecedented chaos as each legion received conflicting divine guidance. Lucius the Eternal, champion of Slanesh and veteran of countless perfect duels, found himself compelled to challenge not just enemy warriors, but members of his own warband. The Dark Prince's usual whispers of aesthetic violence had become a screaming demand for conflict against anyone and everyone who might provide the sensation of combat. The ancient duelist, who had once fought with surgical precision, now attacked with desperate randomness as he tried to satisfy impulses he could no longer understand. Ahriman of the Thousand Suns, master sorcerer and seeker of forbidden knowledge, discovered that his spells were producing entirely unpredictable effects as Tzeentch's mastery over change became corrupted by his war with Nurgle. Its incantations that should have torn holes in reality instead created temporal loops that trapped the caster. Rituals designed to grant foresight showed only conflicting visions of futures that cancelled each other out. The great sorcerer, who had spent 10,000 years accumulating power and knowledge, found himself afraid to cast even the simplest spell, lest it backfire catastrophically. Typhus, herald of Nurgle and master of the Death Guard, experienced perhaps the most disturbing transformation of all. The diseases that had been his constant companions for millennia began behaving erratically as his patron's conflict with Tzeentch introduced chaotic elements into their carefully ordered decay. Plagues that should have spread with mathematical precision instead mutated randomly, sometimes healing their targets instead of harming them. But the ancient Terminator, who had found peace in the certainty of entropy, now faced the terrifying prospect of change without purpose or direction. The crisis deepened when the warbands that had served chaos undivided found themselves torn apart by competing loyalties. These Space Marines, who had maintained their independence by serving all 4 gods equally, discovered that such neutrality was no longer possible. Each deity demanded exclusive loyalty, viewing any service to their rivals as betrayal worthy of immediate punishment. Abaddon the Despoiler, War Master of Chaos and Master of the Black Legion, faced the greatest challenge of his long existence, as the unity he had spent millennia building began to crumble around him. The Black Legion had succeeded where other traitor forces had failed, precisely because it drew strength from all aspects of chaos, creating a synthesis that was greater than any single god's influence. Now that synthesis was being torn apart, as each patron demanded that their followers turn against the servants of rival deities. Standing in the command center of the vengeful spirit, surrounded by the trophies of countless victories against the Imperium, Abaddon felt the weight of 10,000 years of careful planning beginning to collapse. Captains who had served him faithfully since the days of the Horus Heresy now reported that their companies were fragmenting along religious lines. Warriors who had fought side by side for millennia were turning their weapons on each other as their patron god's war filtered down through the ranks. "But enough!" the War Master roared, his voice amplified by voxcasters throughout the massive battle barge. "We are the sons of Horus. We serve chaos entire, not the petty jealousies of individual gods." But his words carried little weight against the psychic pressure of divine fury. Even as he spoke, Abaddon could feel the competing influences of the four gods pressing against his consciousness, each demanding that he choose a side in their cosmic conflict. The mark of chaos undivided that he bore, once a symbol of unity and balance, now felt like a brand that burned with competing fires. The fragmenting of the Black Legion sent shockwaves throughout the forces of chaos. If even Abaddon's carefully maintained unity could not survive the gods' war, what hope did lesser warlords have of maintaining cohesion among their forces? The answer came swiftly and brutally. Across the galaxy, Chaos Space Marine warbands began turning on each other with unprecedented savagery. The Night Lords, who had always prided themselves on their independence from divine influence, found themselves caught in the crossfire as their allies demanded they choose sides. The Iron Warriors, masters of siege warfare who had served Chaos Undivided for 10 millennia, watched their carefully constructed alliances collapse as ancient partnerships dissolved into bitter rivalry. The violence was not limited to Space Marines. Demon Princes, those ascended champions who had achieved immortality through their service to the Dark Gods, discovered that their divine patrons' war created impossible conflicts within their own nature. Belacor, the first demon prince and ancient enemy of the Chaos Gods, found grim satisfaction in watching his former masters tear each other apart. But even he could not escape the consequences of their conflict. Across the daemon worlds, lesser demon princes found themselves literally torn apart as competing divine influences fought for control of their souls. Those who had served single gods discovered that their patrons' war with rivals created psychic feedback that threatened their very existence. Those who had attempted to serve multiple masters faced even worse fates as the gods' mutual hatred expressed itself through their mortal champions. The chaos spread beyond the traitor legions to the countless chaos cults that had taken root across the Imperium. On 1,000 worlds, the secret societies that had worshipped the dark gods in unity for generations began experiencing schisms that tore their organizations apart. Cult leaders who had maintained careful balance between different aspects of chaos found themselves forced to choose single patrons or face destruction. On Morning Star, an agri-world in the Segmentum Solar, the Crimson Covenant cult had operated in secret for 3 centuries, drawing converts from among the planet's downtrodden worker population. Their rituals had honored all 4 chaos gods equally, promising different forms of salvation to different temperaments. But as the divine war intensified, the cult's unity collapsed into 4 rival factions, each claiming that their chosen deity was the only true path to salvation. The Kornati faction, led by former Imperial Guard veterans, preached that only through honest violence could the oppressed workers achieve freedom from their imperial masters. The Slaneshi cultists, drawn primarily from the world's artistic community, promised transcendence through perfect experience and unlimited sensation. The Tsentian followers, largely composed of tech adepts and educated citizens, offered power through knowledge and the ability to reshape reality itself. The Nurglite sect, comprised mainly of agricultural workers intimately familiar with cycles of growth and decay, provided comfort through acceptance of inevitable entropy. What had once been a unified resistance movement became a 4-way civil war that consumed the planet's underground and eventually spilled into open conflict. Imperial authorities, initially baffled by the chaos, and eventually realized that their greatest enemies were destroying each other and chose to let the purge run its course. Similar scenes played out across the galaxy as the gods' war trickled down through every level of chaos worship. Ancient alliances crumbled, careful balances were destroyed, and the unified threat that chaos had represented for 10,000 years began to fragment into competing factions that often hated each other more than they hated the Imperium. The Imperium itself began to adapt to this new reality with the pragmatic brutality that had sustained it for 10 millennia. Inquisitors reported that chaos incursions were becoming more frequent, but also more self-defeating, as rival factions spent as much effort fighting each other as they did attacking Imperial forces. Naval patrols discovered Chaos fleets engaged in civil wars that left them vulnerable to Imperial counterattack. On some worlds, clever Imperial governors began exploiting the divisions within Chaos ranks, offering tacit support to whichever faction seemed most likely to destroy their rivals. The strategy was dangerous beyond measure. Any alliance with Chaos carried the risk of corruption, but in the desperate circumstances created by the Gods' War, even the most Puritan Imperial commanders found themselves considering options that would have been unthinkable in more stable times. The Adeptus Astartes, those loyal space marines who served as the Imperium's greatest warriors, found themselves facing an enemy that was simultaneously more dangerous and more vulnerable than ever before. Chaos Space Marines fought with unprecedented desperation, knowing that defeat might mean abandonment by gods too distracted to grant them resurrection, but they also fought without coordination, their traditional unity replaced by fratricidal hatred that Imperial forces could exploit. Captain Uriel Ventris of the Ultramarines, leading a company in the defense of the Ultramar sector, reported to his chapter master that Chaos forces seemed to be operating under different tactical doctrines than those recorded in 10,000 years of conflict reports. Where once traitor legions had coordinated their assaults to maximize their combined effectiveness, now they seemed more interested in preventing their rivals from achieving victory than in securing their own objectives. As the transformation was perhaps most visible in the Black Crusades themselves, those great campaigns that had periodically emerged from the Eye of Terror to threaten Imperial space. The 13th Black Crusade, which had achieved unprecedented success through Abaddon's careful coordination of diverse Chaos factions, now seemed impossible to repeat. The War Master's own reports, intercepted by Imperial intelligence agencies, suggested that he was spending more time preventing civil war among his own forces than planning attacks against Imperial targets. As the chapter reached its climax, the full scope of the transformation became clear. The forces of Chaos, which had represented a unified existential threat to the Imperium for 10,000 years, were fracturing along religious lines that made coordinated resistance impossible. The very strength that had made them so dangerous, their supernatural unity through shared corruption, had become a weakness as their patron gods turned against each other. But this was not necessarily cause for celebration among Imperial forces. A fragmented chaos was in some ways more dangerous than a unified one, as unpredictable faction conflicts created opportunities for devastating surprise attacks. Worse still, the breakdown of traditional chaos hierarchy meant that individual warlords were more likely to pursue desperate, apocalyptic strategies that could devastate entire star systems, even if they achieved no strategic objectives. The mortal followers of Chaos had become pawns in a game whose rules they could not understand, played by entities whose conflict threatened the very foundations of reality. Their gods, once sources of power and purpose, had become distant thunderstorms that brought only chaos and confusion. In the breaking of the traitor legions, the galaxy glimpsed both the potential salvation and the possible doom that awaited when even the forces of darkness turned against themselves. The great game had become something that no longer served any mortal purpose, and its players, both willing and unwilling, could only endure the storm and hope that something recognizable would remain when the cosmic fury finally exhausted itself. Chapter 8. The Eye Tears Open. The war between the Chaos Gods had begun in the deepest regions of the Immaterium, but as their conflict intensified beyond all precedent, the barriers between the warp and real space began to buckle under the pressure of divine fury. What had started as a cosmic struggle in dimensions beyond mortal comprehension was now threatening to tear the material universe apart as competing godly influences fought to impose their will on reality itself. The Eye of Terror, that ancient wound in space-time that had scarred the galaxy for 10,000 years, began expanding at a rate that terrified even the most experienced navigator houses. Where once the great warp storm had grown slowly over millennia, now it devoured star systems with each passing day. But this was not the controlled expansion that had characterized its previous growth. This was chaotic, unpredictable enlargement that reflected the civil war raging within its depths. Tech priests monitoring the eye from the fortress world of Cadia's neighboring systems reported readings that defied all understanding. The storm's boundary was not simply moving outward, it was fragmenting into multiple overlapping zones, each dominated by the influence of a different chaos god. Where Khorne's power held sway, the eye became a red maelstrom of pure violence that turned gravity itself into a weapon. Regions influenced by Slaanesh transformed into prismatic spirals of light that induced madness in any mortal who observed them directly. Tzeentch's domains became impossible geometries that hurt to perceive, while Nurgle's areas festered with visible decay that somehow existed in the vacuum of space. But the eye's expansion was only the beginning. Across the galaxy, new warp rifts began tearing open with unprecedented frequency and violence. These were not the minor incursions that Imperial forces had battled for centuries, but massive wounds in reality that immediately began reshaping entire star systems according to the whims of their divine creators. In the Segmentum Obscurus, a rift dominated by Khorne's influence transformed the Mordian system into a realm of eternal war. The planets themselves became weapons, their gravitational fields weaponized to create tidal forces that could crush battle fleets. The void between worlds filled with blood that somehow retained liquid form despite the vacuum, creating crimson nebulae where demons swam through space itself to assault any vessel that dared enter the system. Admiral Spire of the Imperial Navy, commanding the defense fleet at Mordian Prime, transmitted his final report as his flagship was consumed by the expanding anomaly. The enemy fleet has engaged our forces, but they're not attacking us. They're attacking each other. Khorneti vessels are ramming Slaaneshi raiders, while both are being consumed by some kind of liquid space that defies all physics. The demons are ignoring our weapons entirely. They seem more interested in killing each other than conquering our worlds. Emperor preserve us. I think we're witnessing something worse than invasion. We're seeing gods tear each other apart. In the eastern fringe, a Slaaneshi rift near the Tau Empire created what Imperial observers designated as the sensory maelstrom. Entire planets within the affected region began broadcasting psychic signals that induced overwhelming emotional responses in any sentient being who received them. The Tau, with their limited psychic sensitivity, initially believed they could study the phenomenon safely. Within days, their entire research fleet had been consumed by experiences so intense that the survivors could no longer distinguish between pleasure and agony, reality and hallucination. Commander Farsight, leading a Tau response force to investigate the disaster, reported encounters with what he described as demons fighting demons across multiple worlds. His battlesuits recorded footage of Keeper of Secrets dueling bloodthirsters, while Tau fire warriors stood forgotten in the background, their weapons unable to harm entities locked in cosmic combat. The footage, when reviewed by Imperial Inquisitors who later acquired it, showed demon armies so focused on their mutual destruction that they barely acknowledged the presence of mortal forces. The Segmentum Solar itself was not spared. A Tzeentchian rift opened near Mars, was transforming several asteroid belts into crystalline formations that existed in multiple temporal states simultaneously. Tech priests who attempted to study the phenomenon reported that their augmetic implants began evolving uncontrollably, developing new capabilities that their creators had never intended. Entire forges found their machinery spontaneously upgrading itself according to patterns that appeared to be improvements, but followed no logic that human minds could comprehend. Fabricator General Kane of Lucius transmitted an urgent warning to Terra. The blessed machines speak of changes beyond our understanding. Our most sacred patterns are being improved by forces that make mockery of the Omnissiah's designs. We observe demon engines fighting amongst themselves, and their crews apparently forgotten as the machines pursue some incomprehensible mechanical warfare. The very concept of technology is being perverted by competing divine influences. But perhaps the most disturbing manifestation occurred in the Ultima Segmentum, where a Nurglite rift created what Imperial scholars termed the entropy fields. Here, time itself began to decay, causing entire star systems to experience accelerated aging that reduced planets to dust in mere hours, while simultaneously creating temporal loops that prevented the destruction from being complete. Ships that entered the region would emerge centuries older, their crews aged to death, only to loop back and repeat their journey with the same crews somehow restored to life. Captain Castor of the Ultramarines, leading a relief force to evacuate civilians from the affected region, transmitted reports that challenged the fundamental understanding of causality. We have observed the same Imperial Guard regiment dying to plague 17 times, only to be reborn to die again in precisely the same manner. The Nurglite demons appear to be locked in combat with Sinchian forces, creating some kind of temporal battlefield where neither side can achieve lasting victory. The civilian populations caught in these loops are experiencing death and rebirth in endless cycles, each iteration leaving them more degraded than the last. The psychological toll on Imperial forces witnessing these phenomena was immense. Space Marines, genetically engineered to face any horror the galaxy could produce, now found themselves struggling to comprehend conflicts where their very presence seemed irrelevant. The Chaos forces they had spent 10,000 years learning to fight were now too busy destroying each other to pose their traditional threat. Brother Sergeant Teal of the Ultramarines, a veteran of countless battles against Chaos incursions, reported to his chapter master, "The enemy ignores us completely. We fired upon demon legions for 6 hours straight, and they did not return fire. They were too engaged in their own battles to acknowledge our existence. I do not know how to fight an enemy that considers us beneath notice." The effects extended far beyond military engagements. Psychers across the galaxy began experiencing visions so contradictory and intense that the traditional role of Imperial divination became impossible. But astropaths found themselves receiving messages from multiple futures simultaneously, each cancelling out the others. Battle psychers discovered that their powers produced random effects as the psychic currents of the warp became chaotic streams of competing divine influence. Chief Librarian Varro Tigurius of the Ultramarines, renowned for his prophetic abilities, submitted a report to the High Lords of Terra that would become one of the most disturbing documents in Imperial archives. The future is fragmenting. I perceive countless possible outcomes, but they are all occurring simultaneously in different layers of reality. Khorne's influence shows victory through endless war. Slanesh reveals transcendence through perfect sensation. Tzeentch promises transformation through infinite change. Nurgle offers peace through final decay. Yet all these futures are somehow equally real, equally false, and equally impossible. The Emperor's light grows dim as competing divine wills fight for control of destiny itself. Navigator houses, those ancient bloodlines whose psychic gifts had guided Imperial ships through the warp for 10,000 years, faced the complete breakdown of their abilities. The Empyrean, once dangerous but predictable in its patterns, had become a roiling mass of contradictory currents that changed faster than human consciousness could adapt. Navigator Magistrix Quintanus of House Belisarius transmitted an emergency edict to all Imperial fleets. Warp travel is no longer possible using traditional methods. The currents that have guided our vessels for millennia have become warfare zones, where divine influences battle for dominance. Ships attempting passage find themselves caught between competing warp storms, their navigators driven mad by visions that conflict with fundamental reality. We have lost 17 vessels in the past week alone, not to daemon attack, but to navigation hazards that should not exist. The Astronomicon itself, that great psychic lighthouse that had guided humanity through the stars since the Emperor's internment upon the Golden Throne, began to flicker under the strain of the gods' conflict. Tech priests monitoring the beacon reported fluctuations in its signal that corresponded directly with the intensity of divine warfare in the deepest regions of the warp. As Adeptus Ministorum representatives on Terra observed the most terrifying phenomenon of all, moments when the Emperor's psychic presence seemed to be struggling not against external threats, but against the chaos created by the gods' mutual destruction. During these episodes, the Astronomicon would dim as the master of mankind was forced to shield Terra itself from psychic reverberations that threatened to tear the planet apart. High Lord Ecclesiarch Jacobus transmitted classified reports to the inner circles of the Imperium's leadership. His divine will maintains our protection, but the strain grows with each passing day. We observe fluctuations in the Emperor's light that suggest he is fighting a defensive war against forces that seek not conquest, but simple destruction. The throne world itself shakes when the god's fury reaches its peak intensity. Across the Imperium, populations began experiencing mass psychic phenomena that defied all attempts at containment or explanation. Planetary governors reported cities where citizens would simultaneously experience visions of endless war, perfect pleasure, infinite change, and peaceful decay. Mental institutions overflowed with patients who insisted they were experiencing multiple contradictory realities at once. On Valhalla, the entire population of Hive Primus began experiencing collective hallucinations, where they fought in battles that were simultaneously glorious victories and crushing defeats. On Katashan, jungle fighters reported that the deadly flora was evolving and devolving simultaneously, creating ecosystems that existed in multiple states of development at once. On Krieg, the Deathworld's population began experiencing regeneration cycles that healed their war-damaged bodies only to subject them to new forms of decay. The Inquisition, humanity's shield against the threats of chaos, found itself overwhelmed by phenomena that transcended their traditional understanding of corruption. Inquisitor Lord Cottes of the Ordo Malleus compiled reports from across the galaxy that painted a picture of reality itself under siege. We face not invasion, but transformation. The gods of chaos war amongst themselves with such intensity that their conflict spills over into dimensions that should remain separate. Entire star systems exist in multiple states simultaneously. We cannot fight an enemy that is simultaneously our greatest threat and its own greatest weakness. As the chapter reached its climax, the full scope of the transformation became apparent. The galaxy was not merely facing a new form of chaos incursion. It was witnessing the fundamental breakdown of the barriers between physical and psychic reality. The war between gods had become so intense that it was rewriting the basic laws that governed existence, creating a universe where multiple contradictory truths could exist simultaneously. The Emperor's light continued to flicker as the master of mankind struggled to maintain humanity's defenses against a threat unlike any faced in 10,000 years of warfare. The Chaos Gods, in their desperate pursuit of mutual destruction, had created conditions where victory for any single force was impossible, but where the concept of reality itself might not survive their conflict. In the deepest vaults of the Imperial Palace, tech priests monitored readings that suggested the fundamental constants of physics were beginning to fluctuate in response to divine warfare. The universe itself was becoming unstable as forces that should have remained separate fought for dominance over the basic nature of existence. The Eye of Terror continued to expand, but now it was no longer alone. Across the galaxy, wounds in reality multiplied as the gods' war tore through every barrier that had previously contained their influence. The material universe hung in the balance, as entities whose conflict threatened the very concept of existence continued their desperate struggle for dominance. Reality screamed, and the echo reached every corner of the galaxy, as mortals and immortals alike discovered that some wars were too vast for any outcome but mutual annihilation. Chapter 9. Strange Alliances. As the null zones expanded, and reality itself began to fracture under the pressure of divine warfare, the four Chaos gods found themselves facing a truth that their eternal pride had long refused to acknowledge. Their conflict had grown beyond any single deity's ability to control or win. The expanding voids of non-existence threatened to consume not just their rivals, but themselves and everything they had ever created. For the first time in their cosmic existence, or the possibility of mutual annihilation forced them to consider the unthinkable: cooperation. The first alliance formed not from wisdom, but from shared revulsion. Khorne and Nurgle, despite their fundamental differences, found themselves united by their disgust at what they perceived as the fundamental corruption of warfare itself. Where the blood god saw honest battle being perverted into elaborate ritual, and the Plague Father witnessed the natural cycle of decay being twisted into chaotic change, both identified a common enemy in their more intellectually complex rivals. The alliance began with a simple recognition transmitted across the dimensional barriers between their domains. Khorne's message was characteristically direct. Brother of endings, the corruptors mock us both. Tzeentch turns war into schemes within schemes, while Slaanesh makes battle into theatre. Join me, and we will cleanse this infection with honest steel and inevitable decay. Nurgle's response carried the weight of cosmic weariness. Indeed, my wrathful sibling, their machinations have grown beyond all bounds. Change and excess without purpose or end. They violate the natural order that binds us all. Let us teach them the beauty of simplicities, war that ends in death, and death that feeds new growth. The philosophical foundation of their alliance was surprisingly coherent. Both gods represented fundamental forces that operated according to clear, understandable principles. Khorne's violence was honest and direct, warrior against warrior, strength against strength, with victory going to the superior fighter. Nurgle's decay followed natural law. All things aged, died, and were reborn in endless cycles that needed no scheming to maintain their course. Against this stood Tzeentch and Slaanesh, whose domains had grown increasingly complex and self-referential. The architect of fate's plans had become so elaborate that they seemed to serve no purpose beyond their own continuation. The Dark Prince's pursuit of sensation had evolved into experiences so abstract that they bore no resemblance to any emotion a mortal mind could comprehend. When the alliance was formally consecrated through a ritual that took place simultaneously in the Brass Citadel and the Garden of Nurgle, the effects were immediate and catastrophic for their enemies. Bloodletters marched alongside plague-bearers for the first time in cosmic history, of their combined assault on the Crystal Labyrinth, breaking through defenses that had withstood individual attacks for millennia. Lord of Change Vakath the Far-Seer, defending one of Tzeentch's most important strongholds, transmitted desperate warnings to his master. The strategies fail. Where we plan for the fury of Khorne, we face also the patience of Nurgle. Where we prepare for plague, we encounter also rage. Their alliance creates tactical combinations that our computational matrices cannot resolve. The assault on Slaanesh's domain proved equally effective. Great Unclean Ones provided patient, methodical pressure that prevented the Dark Prince's forces from retreating into their usual elaborate defensive formations, while Bloodthirsters delivered devastating strikes that cut through Slaanesh's aesthetic defenses with brutal efficiency. Keeper of Secrets Heartrender, commanding the defense of one of Slaanesh's most prized pleasure palaces, found herself facing an impossible tactical situation. How do we seduce enemies who want nothing we can offer? The Khornate demons care only for simple combat, while Nurgle's children find beauty in decay itself, our promises of perfect sensation and refined experience fall on deaf ears. They fight as if our very existence is an affront to their nature. But the Alliance's success carried the seeds of its own destruction. As Khorne and Nurgle's combined forces achieved unprecedented victories against their rivals, each god began to see opportunities for advancement that their partner had not anticipated. The Blood God noticed that many of the territories being conquered contained military resources that could strengthen his own position. The Plague Father observed that the diseases he was spreading to weaken their enemies were also infecting regions that could be claimed for his own domain. The first crack in their alliance appeared when their forces reached the borders between Tzeentch and Slaaneish's domains, regions where change and excess had intermingled to create hybrid territories that belonged fully to neither god. Khorne's forces immediately moved to claim these areas for honest warfare, while Nurgle's demons sought to establish them as gardens for new forms of decay. Bloodthirster Angrath, leading the assault on a crystalline fortress that shifted between states of rigid order and fluid chaos, or found himself in direct conflict with Great Unclean One, Bolothrax, over the spoils of victory. The citadel falls to our axes, Decay Father. By right of conquest, it belongs to Khorne. But Bolothrax, ancient and patient, had his own interpretation of the situation. Nay, brass warrior, the fortress dies by my plagues, and what dies belongs to the cycle. I will plant gardens in its ruins, and they shall feed new life for eons to come. As their forces clashed over the very territories they had just conquered together, both gods realized that their alliance had been built on a foundation of shared hatred rather than compatible goals. Their brief cooperation had been possible only as long as they faced external enemies. The moment they achieved victory, their fundamental differences reasserted themselves with devastating force. Meanwhile, Tzeentch and Slaanesh, driven together by the desperate need to counter their enemy's unexpected alliance, discovered that their own cooperation faced even greater challenges. The Architect of Fate approached the Dark Prince with characteristic complexity. Sibling of sensation, observe how our crude brothers achieve through simple alliance what neither could accomplish alone. Yet their very simplicity reveals the flaw in their design. They cannot see beyond immediate victory. Join with me, and we shall weave a response that turns their strength against itself. Slaanesh found the proposal intriguing precisely because it seemed impossible. My dear Changer, your offer fascinates me, because it should not work. We represent the pinnacle of complexity, you through infinite possibility, I through transcendent experience. Can such sophistication coexist, or will we create something so elaborate that it collapses under its own weight? Their alliance was far more intellectually elegant than that of their enemies, built on the recognition that order and excess could enhance each other when properly balanced. Tzeentch's mastery of planning could create frameworks within which Slaanesh's pursuit of perfect sensation could operate without descending into chaos. Simultaneously, the Dark Prince's understanding of aesthetic beauty could give meaning and purpose to the Architect of Fate's endless schemes. When they combined their forces, the results were spectacular. Demon armies that fought according to constantly evolving tactical doctrines while simultaneously performing their battles as artistic exhibitions proved nearly impossible for their enemies to counter. Lords of Change worked in harmony with Keepers of Secrets to create strategies that were both devastatingly effective and breathtakingly beautiful. The counterattack against Khorne and Nurgle's alliance caught both gods completely off guard. Pink Horrors and Demonettes fought side by side, their combined assault creating psychological warfare campaigns that drove even bloodletters to distraction. The simple, direct nature that had been Khorne and Nurgle's strength became a weakness when faced with enemies who could adapt their tactics faster than their targets could respond. Great Unclean One, Morbidex, was defending Nurgle's primary breeding grounds, reported unprecedented tactical confusion. The enemy's strategies change faster than diseases mutate. Where we prepare for Slanesh's seductions, we face Tzeentch's mutations. Where we counter Tzeentch's sorcery, we encounter Slanesh's aesthetic weapons. Our steady, methodical responses cannot keep pace with their fluid adaptations. But just as their enemy's alliance had failed due to fundamental incompatibilities, Tzeentch and Slanesh's cooperation began to collapse when their sophisticated combination created results that neither had anticipated. Their joint strategies became so complex that they began to evolve beyond either God's ability to control or understand. Tzeentch discovered that Slanesh's influence was transforming his careful plans into artistic expressions that served no logical purpose. Schemes that should have achieved specific tactical objectives instead became elaborate performances designed to create perfect moments of aesthetic experience. The architect of fate found himself creating art when he intended to create victory. Slanesh faced the opposite problem. Tzeentch's influence was making the Dark Prince's pursuit of perfect sensation increasingly cerebral and abstract. What should have been direct emotional experiences became complex intellectual exercises that satisfied the mind while leaving the spirit empty. The Dark Prince discovered himself thinking when intended to feel. Lord of Change Kairos Fateweaver, as attempting to coordinate their combined assault on Khorne's citadel, experienced the breakdown firsthand. I see the future where we achieve victory through perfect strategy, but simultaneously witness the past where we achieve defeat through perfect beauty. The timelines contradict themselves because our alliance serves purposes that cancel each other out. As both alliances crumbled simultaneously, the demon armies found themselves in increasingly surreal situations. Bloodletters who had been fighting alongside plague-bearers against pink horrors suddenly found their plague-bearer allies had become enemies again, while the pink horrors they had been fighting were now potential allies against their former partners. The temporal paradoxes created by these shifting loyalties began to tear holes in the fabric of time itself. The battles were fought where the participants changed sides multiple times during the same engagement, creating causal loops that defied all logic. Demons discovered themselves simultaneously allied with and opposed to the same enemies, leading to conflicts where victory and defeat became meaningless concepts. Bloodthirster Skarbrand, ancient and proud, found himself locked in combat with enemies who kept becoming allies, and then enemies again within the span of single heartbeats. Who do we fight? Who do we protect? The allegiances change faster than thought itself. I draw my blade against Slanesh's servants, but mid-strike they become our allies against Tzeentch, who was our enemy, but is now our partner against Nurgle, who was our ally, but has become our foe. The psychological toll on the demon armies was severe. These entities, whose existence was defined by absolute loyalty to their patron gods, began experiencing something unprecedented in their cosmic existence: doubt about the very nature of their purpose. If their gods could ally with former enemies and betray former allies within the span of moments, what did loyalty mean? Some demons began to question whether the eternal conflict they had participated in for millions of years served any purpose beyond its own perpetuation. Pink horrors, creatures of pure change, found themselves paradoxically seeking stability in an existence that had become too chaotic even for their mutable nature. Plague-bearers, dedicated to counting and cataloguing, discovered that the shifting alliances made their careful tallies meaningless. Our most disturbing of all were the reports from bloodletters who had begun to question whether the honest combat they served had ever truly existed. If their god could alliance with Nurgle against Tzeentch and Slanesh one moment, then ally with Tzeentch against Nurgle and Slanesh the next, was there any such thing as a true enemy or authentic warfare? The brief moments of cooperation between the gods, rather than providing respite from their conflict, had made the eventual betrayals more devastating than any direct assault. Each god had tasted the possibility of victory through alliance, only to discover that their fundamental natures made such cooperation impossible to maintain. Or the knowledge that unity was theoretically achievable but practically impossible created a new form of cosmic despair that infected every level of their domains. As the chapter reached its climax, all four gods found themselves back in their original positions of mutual opposition, but now with the additional knowledge that even temporary cooperation was a trap that led only to greater dysfunction. The alliances had not solved any of their fundamental problems. They had simply created new forms of suffering that hadn't existed before. The null zones continued to expand, reality continued to fracture, and the gods continued their war with the added bitterness of having experienced hope only to see it crushed by their own inability to transcend their essential natures. They were locked in a conflict that they could not win, could not lose, and could not escape through any strategy or alliance their cosmic minds could conceive. In the depths of the warp, the sound of divine laughter echoed across dimensions, not the laughter of joy or victory, but the hollow laughter of entities who had discovered that even gods could be trapped by the fundamental contradictions of their own existence. The great game had become something that served no player and could satisfy no winner, yet continued because none of its participants could imagine any alternative to eternal, meaningless conflict. Chapter 10. The Null Zones Spread. The failed alliances between the Chaos Gods had taught them a terrible lesson about the impossibility of cooperation, but an even more horrifying truth was beginning to manifest across their domains. The Null Zones, those regions of absolute nothingness that had first appeared where their conflicting influences cancelled each other out, were not merely byproducts of their war. They were cancer, spreading through the very fabric of the warp with increasing velocity, consuming everything that had made chaos possible. What had begun as small tears in reality, where divine forces neutralized each other, had evolved into vast regions of anti-existence that actively sought to expand their boundaries. These were not spaces where order reigned instead of chaos, nor were they voids that could be filled with new creation. They were zones of perfect nullification, where the very concepts of existence and non-existence became meaningless, where even the possibility of possibility was unmade. Tzinch was the first to comprehend the full scope of the catastrophe. From his crystal labyrinth, the architect of fate watched in growing horror as probability lines that had existed since the first sentient thought began simply ceasing to exist. His gift for seeing potential futures revealed an expanding darkness where no futures could exist at all, not because they were prevented from occurring, but because the fundamental framework that made occurrence possible was being systematically destroyed. "This cannot be," he whispered through 1,000 voices, but even as he spoke, he felt the words becoming literally untrue. The null zones were expanding into regions of his domain where change had been an absolute constant for millions of years, to crystal formations that had existed in quantum superposition, simultaneously displaying every possible configuration, were collapsing into states of non-superposition so complete that they had never existed at all. Lord of Change Zeridoth, one of Tzinch's most ancient servants, transmitted what would be his final report before being consumed by an expanding null zone. "Master, the void approaches our observatory. It does not destroy. Destruction implies that something once existed. It simply unbecomings. I can see the mathematics of reality becoming undefined as it advances. The very equations that govern transformation are being divided by zero. I am about to discover what lies beyond the concept of..." The transmission ended, not with static or silence, but with something far more disturbing: the complete absence of any indication that communication had ever been attempted. The Lord of Change hadn't been killed or banished. He had been reduced to a state where he had never existed in any form that could attempt communication. Nurgle experienced the threat differently, but no less terrifyingly. In his garden, where the eternal cycle of death and rebirth had continued unbroken since the first microorganism perished and fed new life. Entire regions were simply dropping out of the cycle entirely. Diseases that had been cultivated for eons were not dying. Dying was still part of his domain. They were becoming undiseases, states of antipathology where the very concept of infection became impossible. Great unclean one, Septicus bloatspawn, tending a grove of plague trees that had grown from the bones of the first plague victims, watched in horror as a null zone expanded to encompass his garden. Grandfather, the blessed rot ceases to progress, but not because it is cured, and not because it is stopped. It simply becomes a state where rot was never a possibility. The trees are not healthy, they are not dead, they are not diseased. They are becoming conditions where the concept of biological state has no meaning. The Plague Father felt something he had not experienced since his ascension to divinity: existential terror. His entire philosophy was built on the understanding that all things must decay. But the null zones were revealing a state beyond decay, where things simply never were. This violated not just his nature, but the fundamental logic that had given birth to his consciousness. Slanesh's experience was perhaps the most disturbing of all. The Dark Prince's palace of pleasure contained experiences that pushed sensation beyond all possible limits, but the approaching null zones didn't numb these experiences or reduce them. They created states where the very possibility of experience ceased to exist. Chambers that had contained perfect agony, transcendent ecstasy, and sensations that mortal minds could never comprehend were becoming spaces where the concept of sensation was undefined. Keeper of Secrets. Luxuria. Infinite, guardian of Slanesh's most prized collection of perfect experiences, found herself facing an enemy that could not be fought, seduced, or understood. My prince, the void consumes the gallery of ultimate sensation. But the experiences are not being destroyed or forgotten. They are becoming states where they could never have been possible. I watch perfection itself being reduced to mathematical impossibility. Even the memory of sensation is being undefined. Khorne's reaction was the most violent, but also the most futile. The blood god commanded vast armies to assault the null zones, only to discover that violence itself became impossible in their presence. His bloodletters charged with chain axes raised, only to find that in proximity to the voids, the very concepts of weapon and target became meaningless. They didn't fail to cause damage. The possibility of damage was being systematically removed from existence. Bloodthirster Ragnarok, the Truth Ripper, leading one such doomed assault, experienced the dissolution firsthand. My lord, do we charge, but there is nothing to charge against? The enemy is not there to be fought. It is absence itself. Our weapons strike at nothingness, and find that even nothingness is too much existence for this void to tolerate. We approach and discover that approach requires direction, but direction requires space, and space requires... His report, like so many others, simply ended as the concepts necessary for communication were consumed by the expanding nullity. What made the null zones truly terrifying was not their destructive power, but their mathematical inevitability. Each god's attempts to counter their rival's influence had created equal and opposite forces that, when combined, produced perfect mathematical cancellation. The zones expanded according to precise calculations that corresponded directly to the intensity of divine conflict in surrounding regions. Ancient demon princes, entities who had survived the war in heaven and witnessed the birth and death of countless civilizations, began simply ceasing to exist as the null zones encountered their immortal essence. These were not deaths that could be avenged or reversals that could be overcome. They were transitions to states where those entities had never achieved existence in any form. Belacor, the first demon prince and ancient enemy of all four gods, found his own existence threatened as null zones began manifesting in the spaces between the gods' domains where he had made his strongholds. For the first time in eons, the Dark Master felt genuine fear as he realized that his eternal vendetta against the Chaos Gods might be cut short, not by their victory over him, but by their mutual annihilation, taking him with them. "Fools!" he raged across dimensions that were themselves beginning to fray. "Your petty war threatens the very foundations of the great game. If chaos itself ceases to exist, what will be left for any of us to rule?" But his warnings fell on deaf ears, for each god was convinced that their rivals were responsible for the spreading nullification. Khorne blamed Tzeentch's over-complex schemes for creating mathematical paradoxes. Tzeentch accused Nurgle of introducing stagnation elements that prevented proper change from occurring. Nurgle pointed to Slaaneş's pursuit of impossible sensations as the source of logical contradictions. Slaaneş insisted that Khorne's mindless violence was destroying the delicate balance necessary for existence. Attempts to contain the null zones failed catastrophically because they required the cooperation that had already proved impossible. Each god's efforts to establish barriers around the voids were immediately undermined by their rivals' competing influences, creating new zones of mathematical cancellation that spread even faster than the originals. Khorne attempted to surround the null zones with rings of pure violence, reasoning that absolute aggression might prevent the mathematical cancellations from occurring, but his barriers were immediately infected by Nurgle's influence, which sought to introduce decay cycles into the violence. When Tzeentch added change elements to improve the design, Slaaneş contributed aesthetic refinements to perfect the experience. The result was complete systemic failure that created 3 new null zones for everyone they had attempted to contain. The psychological impact on the gods themselves began to manifest in ways that their immortal consciousness had never experienced. For the first time since their birth from mortal emotion, they felt genuine uncertainty about their continued existence. These entities, whose power was absolute within their domains and whose influence shaped the destiny of countless civilizations, discovered that they could create conditions under which even their own divinity became impossible. Tzeentch found himself unable to plan for futures that might not exist in any meaningful sense. His infinite calculations began producing results that contradicted themselves, not through complexity, but through simple mathematical impossibility. The architect of fate discovered that fate itself might be a temporary condition that could be accidentally erased through excessive manipulation. Nurgle experienced something that violated his fundamental nature: change without decay. The null zones didn't represent death, which was part of his eternal cycle, but absolute termination of the cycle itself. For a god whose entire existence was based on the understanding that all things must decay and be renewed, the possibility of states where neither decay nor renewal could occur was existentially terrifying. Slaaneş confronted the ultimate limitation of experience, the possibility that experience itself might be a temporary condition that could be exceeded and thereby destroyed. The Dark Prince had spent eons pushing sensation beyond all possible limits, but the null zones revealed that there might be a point where the pursuit of the impossible actually achieved impossibility, destroying the framework that made any sensation possible. Khorne faced the most fundamental challenge to his nature, the prospect of perfect peace achieved not through victory, but through the elimination of conflict itself. The null zones didn't end war by establishing order. They ended war by making the very concepts of aggression and defense meaningless. For the Blood God, but this was worse than defeat. It was the negation of everything that made victory or defeat possible. As the chapter approached its climax, desperate measures were proposed, but immediately abandoned, as each god's mistrust of the others made cooperation impossible even in the face of mutual annihilation. Khorne suggested a temporary truce to establish defensive perimeters, but the others suspected this was a ploy to gain tactical advantage. Tzeentch proposed a complex ritual to mathematical stabilize reality, but his brothers assumed it contained hidden elements designed to benefit only him. Nurgle offered to sacrifice portions of his domain to contain the spread, but the others worried this was a trick to claim their territories. Slaanesh suggested they merge their essences temporarily to create a unified defense, as but none trusted the Dark Prince not to corrupt them in the process. Each proposal was rejected, not because it wouldn't work, but because accepting it would require trust that 10 billion years of conflict had made impossible. The gods found themselves trapped not just by external circumstances, but by their own inability to overcome the fundamental antagonisms that defined their very nature. The null zones continued to expand with mathematical precision, consuming demon armies, godly domains, and the very possibility of divine influence. Ancient strongholds that had stood unconquered for millions of years simply ceased to have ever existed. Demon princes who had shaped the course of galactic history were reduced to states where their influence had never been possible. In the material universe, the effects became increasingly visible as regions of space began displaying impossible physics, where the fundamental forces that governed reality became undefined. Imperial scientists observed star systems where gravity, electromagnetism, and nuclear forces simply ceased to operate according to any understandable principles. The gods, for the first time in their existence, experienced genuine fear, not of defeat, not of pain, but of the possibility that existence itself might be a temporary condition that they had accidentally learned how to terminate. They had become so powerful that they could destroy the very framework that made their power possible, and their mutual hatred made it impossible for them to stop the process they had initiated. As the chapter concluded, the expansion of null zones continued with relentless mathematical inevitability, and the four Chaos gods began to realize that they might have inadvertently created the only enemy in the universe capable of defeating them permanently, the simple mathematical consequence of their own infinite conflict. Reality itself had become unstable under the pressure of their war, and unless they could find a way to overcome billions of years of mutual hatred, they might succeed in destroying not just each other, but the very possibility of existence that had given birth to them all. Chapter 11. The Price of Victory. As the null zones spread with relentless mathematical precision, consuming ever larger portions of their domains, and threatening the very possibility of existence, the four Chaos gods were forced to confront a truth so fundamental that it challenged the core of their divine nature. The war they had waged with unprecedented fury was approaching a conclusion that none of them had anticipated. Not victory for any single power, but a resolution so complete that it would negate the very concepts that had given birth to them all. Khorne was the first to grasp the full implications of what total victory would mean. Standing amidst the brass towers of his citadel, watching his blood letters march endlessly against enemies that were increasingly his fellow gods rather than external foes, the blood god experienced a moment of terrible clarity. If he succeeded in destroying Tzeentch, Nurgle, and Slaanesh completely, what would remain for him to fight? Yet the realization struck him with the force of a collapsing star. War without opposition was not war. It was simply existence without meaning. The fury that defined his nature required enemies to rage against, rivals to overcome, challenges to face. In a universe where he stood as the sole remaining power, there would be no battles to win, no skulls worthy of his throne, no blood that mattered enough to spill. "What is war?" he rumbled, his voice shaking the foundations of his domain, "if there is nothing left to war against? What is victory if there are no worthy enemies to defeat?" For the first time in his existence, the blood god felt something approaching doubt. Every skull he had claimed, every battle he had won, every moment of glorious combat, all of it had meaning only in relation to forces that opposed him. Without his rivals, his victories would become as meaningless as victories against inanimate objects. The eternal war he craved would devolve into empty gesture against powerless targets. The same terrible understanding was dawning on Tzeentch, though the architect of fate approached it through the complex pathways of infinite calculation. From his crystal labyrinth, surrounded by probability matrices that grew increasingly unstable as the null zones expanded, he began to perceive a future where his mastery over change had eliminated all sources of resistance to transformation. In such a future, change would become the only constant, but constant change without opposition was indistinguishable from stagnation. If everything could be altered at will, if no force existed to provide resistance or structure, then transformation would lose all meaning. A change without something to change from or toward was not progress or evolution. It was merely random fluctuation in a void. "Perfect," Tzeentch whispered, through dimensions that folded upon themselves in impossible geometries. "Perfect change, perfect possibility. Perfect nothing. Change requires something to change. Schemes require opposition to scheme against. In absolute possibility, all possibilities become equally meaningless." The god who had spent eons weaving plots within plots began to see the ultimate plot, the one where his complete success would destroy the very framework that made plotting possible. Victory over his rivals would not grant him mastery over change. It would eliminate the conditions that made change meaningful. In his garden of diseases and decay, Nurgle confronted the same paradox from yet another angle. Of the Plague Father's entire philosophy was built on the understanding that decay was meaningful only as part of a greater cycle. Death feeding new life, endings enabling new beginnings. But if his competitors were destroyed completely, what new life could emerge from their ending? The Lord of Decay watched his carefully tended plagues consume themselves for lack of healthy tissue to infect, and understood with growing horror that perfect decay was indistinguishable from perfect sterility. Without renewal, without the possibility of new growth to corrupt and claim, his domain would become a static wasteland where nothing could live, grow, change, or die. Entropy without regeneration was not the beautiful cycle he represented. It was simply emptiness. "All things must decay," he murmured to his plague-bearers. But for the first time, the words carried uncertainty rather than absolute conviction. But what meaning has decay if there is nothing left to be renewed? What purpose has ending if there can be no beginning? Nurgle realized that his apparent enemies were actually necessary partners in his cosmic function. Tzeentch provided the change that enabled new growth for him to corrupt. Slaanesh created the experiences that made life worth living long enough to decay. Even Khorne's violence served to clear away the old and make space for new cycles of growth and decay. Without them, his garden would become a desert where nothing could flourish enough to rot. Slaanesh's revelation came through direct experience rather than philosophical contemplation. In the Palace of Pleasure, surrounded by sensations pushed beyond all possible limits, not the Dark Prince began to understand that perfect pleasure was indistinguishable from perfect numbness. Experience without contrast was not transcendent. It was merely undifferentiated sensory noise. Every exquisite agony gained meaning only in relation to moments of peace. Every transcendent ecstasy was defined by its difference from ordinary sensation. Every perfect experience required the existence of imperfect experiences to serve as reference points. Without the harsh simplicity of Khorne's violence, the cerebral complexity of Tzeentch's schemes, or the patient acceptance of Nurgle's decay, Slaanesh's refinements became meaningless exercises in sensation without context. "Perfection," the Dark Prince whispered, the words carrying harmonics that should have inspired worship, but instead conveyed only emptiness. "Perfect sensation, or perfect experience, perfect boredom. Without contrast, pleasure becomes as meaningless as pain. Without opposition, ecstasy becomes indistinguishable from agony." The god who had pursued the ultimate experience began to see that the ultimate experience was actually the dynamic tension between different types of experience. Victory over rivals would not grant transcendent sensation. It would eliminate the framework that made any sensation transcendent. As each god reached these conclusions independently, something unprecedented began to occur in the deepest levels of the warp. For the first time in cosmic history, all four chaos gods simultaneously contemplated the possibility of compromise. Not alliance for tactical advantage, not temporary cooperation against external threats, but fundamental philosophical compromise that would preserve the dynamic tensions that gave their existence meaning. Khorne was the first to voice what they all understood. We cannot destroy each other without destroying ourselves. War without worthy enemies is meaningless. But how can gods who exist as eternal opposition find balance without betraying their own nature? Tzeentch responded through probability cascades that outlined millions of potential compromises. Change requires constants to define itself against. We could establish parameters, boundaries that preserve our conflicts while preventing mutual annihilation. But any agreement must account for the fundamental untrustworthiness of all parties involved. Nurgle's contribution carried the weight of cosmic weariness. The cycle requires all elements to function. At death and life, growth and decay, beginning and ending, all must exist for any to have meaning. Perhaps our war itself is the true constant, and victory was never the actual goal. Slaaneish's response was more complex, carrying undertones of genuine desperation. Without opposition, transcendence becomes impossible. Our conflicts create the very tensions that make existence worth experiencing. But how do we preserve necessary opposition while preventing the mathematical cancellations that create null zones? For a moment, just a moment, the possibility of perfect balance hung in the air between them. A cosmic equilibrium where their conflicts would continue eternally without ever approaching the extremes that created null zones. War without genocide, change without chaos, decay without sterility, and pleasure without mindless excess. But the moment their contemplation turned toward concrete implementation, the fundamental paranoia that defined their relationships reasserted itself. Each god immediately began to suspect that the others were proposing compromise only as a trap, a way to achieve victory through apparent concession. Khorne's nature made it impossible for him to believe that his rivals wouldn't use any peace agreement as an opportunity to strike while his guard was down. They speak of balance, but I hear the whispers of schemes within schemes. The moment we cease our war, they will alliance against me. Tzeentch found himself calculating how any proposed balance could be manipulated to his advantage and immediately assumed his rivals were doing the same. Perfect balance is itself a form of stagnation, that they offer equilibrium, but they mean to trap me in a state where change becomes impossible. Nurgle's experience of endless betrayal throughout the great game made him certain that his siblings were simply attempting new forms of deception. They promise cooperation, but I smell the rot of lies beneath their words. They would use peace as a weapon against my necessary decay. Slaaneish's pursuit of perfect experience extended to perfect paranoia, the conviction that any agreement would somehow deprive the Dark Prince of the sensations that made existence worthwhile. They offer balance, but they mean to deny me the beautiful extremes that give life meaning. Their compromise is just another form of restriction. As their mutual suspicion derailed every attempt at genuine cooperation, the null zones continued their relentless expansion. Our ancient demon worlds were consumed by voids where existence became mathematically impossible. The very architecture of the warp began to collapse as competing divine influences created ever larger regions of perfect cancellation. Each god's attempts to preserve their own domain while offering apparent compromise to the others created new forms of mathematical paradox. Khorne's efforts to establish balanced warfare resulted in conflicts where victory and defeat cancelled each other out, creating temporal loops where battles occurred without resolution. Tzeentch's schemes to maintain controlled change produced mutations that mutated back into their original forms, creating stasis through excess transformation. Nurgle's attempts to create sustainable decay led to diseases that healed themselves faster than they could spread, resulting in perfect health through perfect corruption. Slaaneş's pursuit of restrained excess produced sensations so carefully controlled that they provided neither pleasure nor pain, achieving perfect numbness through perfect experience. The gods found themselves trapped in a paradox of their own making. They understood intellectually that cooperation was necessary for survival, but their fundamental natures made genuine cooperation impossible. Every attempt at balance immediately became a new form of conflict, and every effort to end the war simply created more sophisticated ways of continuing it. As the chapter approached its climax, the moment of perfect balance, where total victory and total defeat existed simultaneously, teetered on the edge of total annihilation. The null zones had grown so large that they now threatened to consume the gods' core domains, the essential spaces where their consciousness resided. In the brass citadel, regions of pure violence were being neutralized by expanding voids. In the crystal labyrinth, chambers of infinite possibility were collapsing into states of mathematical impossibility. In Nurgle's garden, the eternal cycle of death and rebirth was being replaced by zones where neither death nor life could occur. In the palace of pleasure, rooms containing transcendent sensation were becoming spaces where sensation itself was undefined. Each god faced the same impossible choice: continue the war and risk total annihilation, or attempt cooperation that would violate their fundamental nature and likely result in subtler forms of mutual destruction. Or they stood at the edge of an abyss that they had created through their own conflict, unable to bridge the gaps between them, but equally unable to accept the consequences of their eternal opposition. The price of victory had become clear. It would cost them everything that made victory meaningful, but the price of compromise seemed equally impossible to pay, requiring them to abandon the very characteristics that defined their existence. They were gods trapped by their own nature, powerful enough to destroy the universe, but not wise enough to save it. In the depths of the expanding null zones, reality continued its mathematical dissolution, and the four chaos gods discovered that even divine power had limits when it turned completely against itself. The universe held its breath, as waiting to see whether entities who embodied conflict could find a way to exist without destroying the very possibility of existence. The perfect balance they had glimpsed for just a moment remained tantalizingly close, yet impossibly distant, and time was running out before the null zones consumed enough reality to make the question of balance permanently moot. Chapter 12. The Eternal War Continues. The moment of perfect balance had lasted exactly 13 seconds by mortal reckoning, 13 seconds during which the four chaos gods had simultaneously comprehended both the necessity of their conflict and the impossibility of their victory. In those brief moments, as the null zones reached the very edges of their core domains, and reality itself prepared to collapse into mathematical impossibility, or something unprecedented occurred, the gods chose survival over supremacy. It was not wisdom that saved them, nor sudden enlightenment about the nature of cooperation. It was the simple, brutal calculation that mutual annihilation served no purpose that any of their natures could accept. Khorne realized that eternal war was preferable to no war at all. Tzeentch understood that limited change was better than the unchanging void of non-existence. Nurgle accepted that partial decay was superior to absolute sterility. Slaanesh concluded that constrained sensation exceeded the numbness of obliteration. The withdrawal from total war began not with declarations or formal treaties, but with the simple cessation of their most extreme tactics. Khorne recalled his greatest demon legions from their assaults on rival domains. Tzeentch stopped weaving schemes designed to fundamentally alter his siblings' natures. Nurgle ceased cultivating diseases specifically engineered to destroy the concepts of change and sensation. Slaanesh abandoned the pursuit of experiences so perfect they would negate all other possibilities. But this was not peace. It could never be peace between entities whose very existence was defined by conflict. Instead, what emerged was something far more dangerous than the traditional great game, a form of warfare that acknowledged its own limitations while refusing to abandon its essential nature. The gods established new rules of engagement, not through negotiation or agreement, but through the simple recognition that certain tactics led inevitably to mutual destruction. These unspoken rules were violated immediately and constantly. What within days of the implicit ceasefire, Khorne launched a limited assault on Slaanesh's outer territories, claiming it was merely a traditional border raid rather than an attempt at total conquest. The Dark Prince retaliated by corrupting an entire company of bloodletters into appreciating the aesthetic beauty of violence, transforming them into warrior artists whose devotion to combat became a form of elaborate performance. Tzeentch began implementing minor schemes designed to gradually shift the balance of power among his rivals, while simultaneously working to prevent their own plots from achieving any decisive advantage. The Architect of Fate had learned to scheme against his own schemes, creating layers of self-contradiction that preserved the conflict without allowing it to escalate beyond sustainable levels. Nurgle cultivated new diseases that would weaken his siblings' forces without actually threatening their fundamental existence. The Plague Father developed infections that caused temporary confusion rather than permanent transformation, plagues that induced lethargy rather than death, and bacteria that created manageable suffering rather than absolute decay. The result was warfare more vicious and personal than anything the Great Game had previously produced, conducted with the constant awareness that it could never achieve final victory. The gods fought with the fury of entities who knew they were eternal, tempered by the knowledge that their conflict had limits that could not be exceeded without destroying everything they sought to rule. Their mortal followers struggled to comprehend this new paradigm. Across the galaxy, the traitor legions remained fractured along the religious lines that had emerged during the period of total war. But now they faced the additional challenge of divine patrons who were simultaneously more involved and more restrained in their guidance. The gods paid closer attention to their mortal champions, but that attention came with constraints that made traditional chaos warfare impossible. Abaddon the Despoiler, still struggling to reunite the fragments of his Black Legion, found himself caught between competing pressures that reflected his patron's new relationship. The gods still demanded exclusive loyalty, but they also tacitly acknowledged that complete success for any single faction would destabilize the entire system. "They want us to fight," the War Master observed from the command deck of the Vengeful Spirit. "But they do not want us to win. They demand our service, but they fear our victory. We have become pawns in a game where the players are afraid of achieving checkmate." The fractured Chaos Space Marine warbands adapted to this reality with characteristic brutality. Where once they had pursued absolute victory for their chosen patron, now they fought to maintain the conflicts that sustained their gods without tipping the balance too far in any direction. World Eaters learned to moderate their fury to avoid triggering interventions by rival deities. Emperor's children refined their excess to remain within bounds that would not provoke coalition responses. Most disturbing of all, some Chaos champions began to recognize the artificial nature of their conflicts. What veterans who had participated in the genuine Great Game for millennia could perceive the difference between authentic rivalry and the carefully managed hostility that now characterized divine relations. Kharn the Betrayer, ancient champion of Khorne, experienced moments of clarity that violated everything he thought he understood about his purpose. The blood flows, the skulls are claimed, but the rage feels constrained, as if we fight not for victory, but to maintain the appearance of fighting. Have we become actors performing war, rather than warriors waging it. These doubts spread throughout the ranks of Chaos followers, creating a crisis of faith that the gods could not address without revealing the limitations of their own power. The entities who had once represented absolute concepts were now forced to embody controlled concepts, and their followers could sense the difference even when they could not articulate it. In the material universe, the effects of the gods' new paradigm were equally complex and disturbing. The warp storms that had expanded during the period of total war did not recede. They stabilized at their new, larger boundaries, creating permanent alterations to the galaxy's psychic geography. The Eye of Terror remained significantly larger than its pre-war dimensions, but its expansion had stopped following predictable patterns. Instead of growing uniformly in all directions, it now fluctuated according to the managed conflicts between the gods, creating regions of relative stability surrounded by zones of carefully controlled chaos. The navigator houses adapted to the new reality with characteristic pragmatism, learning to read the artificial patterns in warp currents that reflected divine restraint rather than divine fury. The Empyrean remained dangerous, but it was now dangerous in structured ways that could be anticipated and planned for. The storms follow new patterns, reported Navigator Majestrix Quintanus in her updated charts. They rage and calm according to schedules that suggest deliberate management rather than natural fluctuation. The gods themselves have become navigational hazards that can be predicted because they are no longer truly spontaneous. The Astronomican's flickering ceased, but the great lighthouse never returned to its pre-war strength. The Emperor's psychic beacon now operated at diminished capacity, requiring more concentration from navigator houses and limiting the range of safe warp travel. The Master of Mankind had expended vast energies protecting Terra during the Divine Civil War, and those expenditures left permanent marks on his ability to guide humanity through the stars. Imperial forces adapted to the new strategic reality with the grim efficiency that had sustained them for 10,000 years. The chaos threat remained as dangerous as ever, but it was no longer an existential threat to reality itself. Instead, it had become a known quantity that could be planned for, prepared against, and occasionally exploited when the rival factions turned against each other. Captain Uriel Ventris of the Ultramarines, now promoted to Chapter Master in recognition of his experience fighting the new forms of chaos warfare, who issued tactical guidance that would define Imperial doctrine for millennia to come. The enemy fights differently now. They still seek to corrupt and destroy, but they also seek to preserve the conditions that allow corruption and destruction to continue. This makes them more predictable but also more persistent. We face not conquest, but eternal conflict. The Inquisition developed new protocols for dealing with chaos incursions that acknowledged the artificial limitations on divine power. Inquisitor Lord Catese's revised Malleus Codex included chapters on managed corruption and sustainable heresy that would have been incomprehensible to previous generations of demon hunters. Perhaps most significantly, the galaxy's psychic evolution accelerated as mortal minds adapted to the new reality of restrained divine conflict. Psychers across human space began manifesting abilities that reflected the gods' managed warfare, powers that were strong enough to be useful, but constrained enough to avoid triggering divine attention. The Adeptus Astra Telepathica reported unprecedented developments in psychic discipline as mortals unconsciously learned to operate within the boundaries that divine restraint had established. Where once psychic excess had led to demonic possession or warp-spawned madness, now it led to power that was carefully self-limiting. As years passed, and then decades, the new paradigm solidified into what scholars would eventually term the Second Great Game, a form of divine conflict that acknowledged its own limitations while refusing to abandon its essential nature. The gods fought with controlled fury, schemed with restrained ambition, corrupted with measured excess, and decayed with sustainable entropy. The universe adapted to this new reality, but adaptation was not the same as acceptance. The scars left by the brief period of total war remained visible in expanded warp storms, altered psychic currents, and the permanently changed relationship between the material universe and the immaterium. Most disturbing of all was the knowledge that this new equilibrium was not truly stable. It existed only as long as all four gods maintained their restraint, and their restraint was motivated solely by fear of mutual annihilation. Should any of them forget the lessons of the null zones, should new circumstances arise that changed the calculus of divine conflict, the same forces that had nearly destroyed reality could be unleashed again. Or the gods themselves were acutely aware of this possibility. In the deepest chambers of their domains, they maintained archives of the null zones, not physical records, but conceptual memories of what non-existence felt like. These served as permanent reminders of the price of total war, but they also represented templates for weapons that could be deployed if circumstances ever justified the risk. Ancient demon princes who had survived the period of total war became living monuments to its lessons. Belacor, first among the demon princes, found his hatred of the gods tempered by the understanding that their destruction would likely destroy him as well. He became a figure of grim wisdom, advising lesser demons on the necessity of maintaining conflicts without winning them. As the story drew to its close, the four chaos gods settled into their new relationship, eternal enemies who could never truly defeat each other, bound together by the knowledge that their mutual survival depended on carefully managed conflict. They fought with the passion of entities who existed for war, tempered by the wisdom of creatures who had learned that some victories were too complete to survive. The great game continued, but it was no longer truly a game. It had become a form of cosmic maintenance, a careful balance of forces that preserved the possibility of conflict without allowing that conflict to destroy the framework that made it possible. The gods had learned to play by rules they had imposed on themselves, and those rules would govern their interactions for as long as their eternal natures remained unchanged. In the material universe, mortals looked up at warp storms that raged according to predictable patterns and knew that the age of spontaneous apocalypse had ended. What remained was the age of managed catastrophe, an era where the forces of chaos remained as dangerous as ever, but operated within constraints that made survival possible, if not comfortable. The galaxy had been scarred by divine civil war, but it had not been destroyed. Reality itself bore the marks of the conflict in the form of expanded chaos zones and altered physical laws, but the fundamental structure of existence had survived. The universe remained a place where gods could wage war, mortals could pursue their destinies, and the eternal dance of order and chaos could continue without threatening the stage on which it was performed. Yet in the deepest chambers of the warp, where the memories of null zones were preserved like cautionary tales, the possibility remained that this hard-won stability was only temporary. The gods' natures had not changed. They had simply learned to fear the consequences of unleashing those natures without restraint. Should that fear ever fade, should new circumstances arise that changed the balance of power, the brief period of total war that had nearly ended, everything could return. And next time, the universe might not be so fortunate. The eternal war continued, but now it continued with the knowledge that eternity itself had limits, and that even gods could accidentally destroy the very concepts that gave their existence meaning. In learning the price of absolute victory, the Chaos Gods had discovered the value of absolute restraint, a lesson that would define their conflicts for eons to come, or until they forgot why the lesson had been necessary in the first place. The great game was eternal, but eternity could be ended. That knowledge changed everything while changing nothing, and the universe continued its ancient dance between order and chaos with the understanding that some dances were too vigorous for their own good. In the end, the gods had learned to fear their own success more than their rivals' victory, and that fear had saved them all from the emptiness of total triumph. The war would continue forever, but it would continue within bounds that preserved both the warriors and the battlefield on which they fought their eternal conflicts. The price of victory had been revealed, and it was higher than any of them were willing to pay. So the war continued, constrained by wisdom, powered by eternal hatred, and governed by the hard-learned understanding that some games were too important to ever truly win.